Chapter 820. Could it be that there are no monsters living in the outer edge? Dudian thought in his heart. He thought of the other members of the hunter family who had entered the Forest of Despair. Most of them had explored the forest through the heat source, but none of them had come out. Although heat-tracking vision is a relatively rare perception ability, at least 1 out of 10 pioneers has it. There's no reason for the ancestors of the witch family to explore the area not to bring people with strong perception ability, especially when so many people died in this forest. So, the real dangerous thing here may not emit heat or smell. Its lurking ability is likely to be as strong as the shadow hunters, and its number is far more than the shadow hunters, and its frontal combat ability is stronger. Thinking of this, there was a trace of fear in Dean's heart. So many explorers were buried here, indicating that the hidden danger was extremely terrible. It was not something that he, a dominator, could easily venture into. However, flying high in the abyss was undoubtedly a more dangerous thing. The Wing family was especially good at flying, but they still stopped after exploring the Forest of Despair. It could be seen that they had already tried flying. The first step of crossing the abyss on foot seems to be very difficult. Dean's eyes flashed slightly. He looked up at the sky. The sun had completely set, and a crescent moon emerged from the clouds. The cold glimmer shone on the earth. The weeds on the hillside fluttered in the wind, and the air seemed to be slowly filled with a faint smell of blood. At the same time, he heard a loud roar coming from a very far place behind him. Just by listening to the intensity of the sound, he knew it was a terrible beast. The night came. It was time for the monsters to move. Dean glanced at the wandering undeads around and found that some of them were attracted by the roar, while the others were still wandering unconsciously, as if they would approach at any time. Dean was not worried. He leaned back, lying on the rock, crossed his legs, and looked at the starry sky in the night, lost in thought. As the night deepened, more and more roars of beasts came from all directions, but only the Forest of Despair in front of Dean was as quiet as a dead silence. There was no sound, and the moonlight seemed to be unable to penetrate the forest. Dudian stared at the forest, but still couldn't see anything unusual in it. In the blink of an eye, a night had passed. Dean took a few naps in the middle, but was awakened by the roars of the beasts. There were more monsters wandering in the wilderness behind the hillside, but they did not dare to approach here. Instead, a few undeads slowly wandered over, but seemed to be aware of the smell of Aisha. When they were 200 or 300 meters away from Dean, they stopped, turned around and continued to wander in other directions. Dean woke up at dawn. He took out the food and finished breakfast. He stood up and stretched his muscles. He looked at Aisha, who hadn't slept all night. He felt a bit of pity in his heart even though he knew that she didn't have the habit of sleeping. "It's time to go." Dean took her hand and whispered, "Find something to help us open the way." With that, his eyes fell on a few wandering corpses behind the hillside. He immediately bent down to dig out a rock and threw it at one of them. Pung! It was a perfect hit. This undead was 4 or 5 meters high, but extremely thin. The whole body was like a bag of bones without any flesh. The joints of the bones were protruding with sharp blades. In terms of combat effectiveness, it was not inferior to the general pioneers. Even among the many undeads under the command of the King of Corpses who had bitten Aisha, there was no such high-level undeads. After being hit by the stone, the undeads quickly noticed Dean. Originally, Dean had the undead's powder to cover the smell, and the smell of Aisha made the undeads afraid to approach. But at this moment, he took the initiative to make a move, and suddenly showed the difference, so that the undeads recognized that he was not one of them. Roar! The blade undeads roared and rushed over. Its running posture was extremely strange. It was as thin as a bamboo pole with long hands and feet like a strange worm, but its speed was so fast that it rushed to the front of Dean in a blink of an eye. Dudian immediately rang the bell. Aisha, who was originally expressionless, suddenly shot a cold light in her pure black eyes. She turned to look at the blade undeads. When the blade undeads were looked at by Aisha, the forward body suddenly stopped, as if it was suddenly struck by lightning. The next moment it suddenly screamed, curled up on the ground, shivering. Dean was relieved to see that slavery worked. In the past 2 years in the inner wall, he stayed with Aisha every day and repeatedly consolidated her conditioned reflex training. Especially half a year ago, when she was awakened for the 7th time, she almost lost control. Although she was barely controlled at that time, after that, he strengthened her conditioned reflex training and extended other training besides the basic instructions. For example, the current servant undeads. As early as when Dean brought Aisha back to the giant wall from the wasteland, he knew that the undeads were afraid of Aisha. Later, through experiments, he found that all the undeads that could be captured outside the giant wall would tremble in front of Aisha and dare not approach her. However, Aisha was not like the corpse king that bit her. She could control the undeads autonomously, gather the corpse tide, and even arrange the undeads to be buried underground for sneak attack. This kind of conscious performance did not exist in Aisha. Dean could only rely on himself. Step by step, he tried to let her learn how to control the undeads. Fortunately, controlling the undeads seemed to be the instinct of the corpse king. Although Aisha did not have a higher intelligence response than the other corpse kings, when she was with the other undeads, she seemed to slowly explore the control of these undeads. After a long period of exercise, Dean was finally able to let her drive the enslaved undeads through conditioned reflex training. In this way, he no longer had to let Aisha fight in person. Dang 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 dang. In a continuous series of rhythmic bells, the blade undeads enslaved by Aisha slowly moved forward, passed by Dean, and went to the forest of despair in front. Dean dug out the rocks and hit several other undead. These undeads were angered by Dean and immediately roared and rushed. Dean immediately asked Aisha to control them. When a few undeads rushed in front of Dean, they shivered like the previous blade undeads and did not dare to move forward. Dean let Aisha control them to walk in a group and step into the forest of despair, one after another. He and Aisha followed at a distance of 1 kilometer away. If there was any danger, they could escape in time. If we want to occupy other giant wall, it seems to be the fastest to rely on Aisha to gather the corpse tide to attack. Dean thought. At this time, the blade undeads in the front had walked to the front of the forest of despair. It seemed to hesitate and then slowly walked in. This short hesitation made Dean's eyes slightly condensed. He had long known that although these undeads had no consciousness and intelligence, they still had instincts, including bloodthirst and eating, and fear of the king of corpses. Their fear seemed to be only for the king of corpses. Even in the face of monsters that were dozens or even hundreds of higher than their own hunting level, they would still roar and rush over without knowing what fear was. At this time, the following several undeads also came to the front of the forest of despair. They seemed to be hesitant, but they still stepped in. Dean suddenly had a bad feeling in his heart, but he could not turn back to the giant wall. He could only move forward. Is there a king of corpses in this forest? Yes, undeads are cold-blooded creatures, and there is no heat response. Dean secretly guessed, his eyes dignified. If there was a king of corpses, it was likely to bury the corpse tide. He and Aisha came to the front of the forest together, looking at the dark branches and weeds in the forest. There was an inexplicable feeling of fear in his heart. It seemed that a burst of death was coming, and it was hell ahead. He hesitated, but still resolutely stepped in. After entering the forest, Dean felt that the surrounding temperature seemed to have dropped, and there was a humid feeling. He followed a few undeads for more than 200 meters, and the ominous premonition in his heart was getting stronger and stronger. He stopped, and at the same time the undeads also stopped. He looked around, but saw that the surrounding trees and weeds were silent. There was no wind, as if a dying still picture. The hair on his back was inexplicably erect, and suddenly his heart moved. He immediately let Aisha control the undeads to make a movement. Roar, roar, roar. Under the control of Aisha, a few undeads roared loudly and hit the surrounding trees at the same time. In this silent sound, it seemed to be alive in an instant and became noisy. Dean watched attentively to see what kind of things they would attract. A few undeads wantonly destroyed the trees and roared. After half an hour, when Dean was a little impatient, the sudden scene made his pupils shrink. He saw that under the destroyed trees, a few dark vines with a diameter of about 2 meters suddenly shot out and quickly whipped several undeads. Among them, the blade undeads was the first to be hit. It was obviously good at attack, but not good at defense. It was slapped to the ground by the vines. When the vines lifted, Dean saw it roaring and ready to climb up, but at this moment its body suddenly sank down and seemed to fall. Seeing this scene, Dean did not look back, pulled Aisha and turned to run. Whoosh, whoosh. The wind whistled in his ears, and in a blink of an eye, he rushed out of the forest and came to the plain outside the forest. Turning his head, his line of sight was blocked by the trees of the forest. When he used his X-ray vision, he saw that there was only one undead left. When he saw it, this undead was slapped to the ground by a vine, and quickly sank into the soil under the forest, and then was fixed by the soil. Yes, it was like being frozen and unable to move. Dean was shocked. This was too shocking. Most of these undeads were comparable to the ordinary pioneers. Although 2 of them were slightly weaker, they could not be restricted by the soil, unless the soil he saw was extraordinary. But in his X-ray vision, the soil and sand under the forest were ordinary, and there was nothing special. Fortunately, it did not go too deep, just a short distance of more than 200 meters. Dean had a trace of joy in his heart. Recalling the thick black vines, he felt a throbbing in his heart. This was just a vine, and it could slap the blade undeads to the ground. How huge and terrifying was its body! When he used his X-ray vision to observe, he found that the black vines extended to the depths of the ground, but the distance was too far. His X-ray vision could only see the depth of less than 20 meters, but counting the length of the vines exposed on the surface, it added up to more than 40 meters, and this may only be a small part of the vines. Dean's eyes flickered. After thinking for a moment, he decided to test it again. This time he let Aisha enslave 2 undeads, and then controlled them to walk into the forest, while he and Aisha stood 20 or 30 meters away from the forest. He did not let the 2 undeads go too deep, only about 100 meters away, and then they wantonly destroyed. When the destruction lasted for 4 or 5 minutes, suddenly a strange scene appeared. The sand under the feet of the 2 undeads rolled up and wrapped around their bodies. Soon the 2 angry undeads were completely wrapped in the sand, and then slowly sank into the ground. Dean was dumbfounded, and his heart turned cold. Through his X-ray vision, he saw that after the 2 undeads were dragged into the ground by the sand for more than 10 meters, the sand penetrated all parts of their bodies, and they were completely silent. Then their bodies and bones slowly slid down in the sand until they fell into the depths that he could not see. This sand was actually alive? Dean looked at the vast forest in front of him, and a horrible idea came to his mind. Could it be that the whole forest was a living thing? Among the monsters he had encountered in the past, monsters with a body size of 40 or 50 meters were already quite terrible. But if the whole forest was a living thing, then it could not be measured in meters, but in kilometers. This horrible idea rolled in Dean's mind. After a long time, he slowly calmed down, thinking that he should be thinking too much. This should be some kind of mutated monster beyond his understanding. Perhaps there was a record in the kingdom of God, and it could not be measured as a normal monster. Thinking of this, he wanted to go to the kingdom of God immediately. What has the world become now? The giant wall of Sylvia is just a grain of sand on the whole earth. There are other giant walls and survivors, but how many of these giant walls are there? How big is the kingdom of God? Dean's eyes flashed and he pondered for a long time. His thoughts slowly returned to the desperate forest in front of him. It was obviously impossible to walk on the ground, so he could only fly. But flying was too risky. He did not know if this strange forest would be afraid of using the goddess's limbs. Chapter 8:21. Let's try it first. Dean took out the worm powder from his backpack, and then attracted an undead nearby. He let Aisha enslave it, and then sprinkled the worm powder on it, letting it enter the forest of despair. The undead seemed to react to the smell of the worm powder, but under the deterrence of Aisha, it obediently walked into the forest. After entering the forest, Dean let Aisha control the undead to wreak havoc in the forest. Whoosh! As soon as a few trees were destroyed, the sand suddenly jumped up, wrapped the undead, and pulled it into the depths of the soil, where it was quickly decomposed. Worm powder really doesn't work. Seeing this result, Dean was not too disappointed. Worm powder was everywhere on the border, and the ancestors of the Wing family did not lack it. However, he still could not explore the forest, so he knew that this thing wouldn't work, but he still held a glimmer of hope to try. He took out a small box from his backpack, which contained a piece of the goddess's body. He took the sealed box and lured another undead from nearby. He opened the sealed box, took out a thumb-sized piece of meat, and put it in the hollow bone pit behind the neck of the undead, and then drove it to the forest. After this thin piece of meat came out, the air was filled with a strange rotten smell. This smell was so strong that even the rotten and bloody smell of the undead was completely covered. Dean stared at it. Soon, he found something different. Before the undead approached the forest, the trees in the forest suddenly twisted as if they were alive. They all wriggled and shrank into the soil, all the way down to the depths of the ground where the darkness could not be seen. This scene surprised Dean a little. He did not expect that a small piece of the goddess's body would have such a magical effect. Every time the undead took a step forward, a piece of trees shrank into the sand, which looked extremely shocking. The dark forest seemed to be purified, and a large piece of trees shrank into the sand, leaving only the bare dark ground. The rest of the trees in the distance were twisting uneasily, as if hesitating to escape into the sand, but as the undead approached, more and more trees shrank into the ground. Dean was shocked not only by the effect of the goddess corpse but also by the forest. All the trees that he had seen before were able to move. Was this still a plant? Or was this a group of monsters disguised as plants? Or could it be that it wasn't a group, but just one? He had imagined the scene of the abyss countless times in his mind, but he did not expect to be deeply shocked before he even stepped into it. It was as if an unknown and dangerous door was slowly opening in front of him. After a moment, he slowly came back to his senses. He looked at the semicircle of trees in the center of the undead. He slowly lifted his feet and walked behind the undead. He prayed in his heart, hoping that this strange forest did not have a high level of intelligence. If it deliberately lured him in, then he would definitely die. All the trees within a radius of 500 meters of the undead shrank into the sand. As the undead continued to move forward, a bare road was slowly opened up in the forest. After 7 or 8 miles, Dean looked back and found that far behind him, the black plants were emerging one after another. They still maintained the previous motionless appearance, and the wind couldn't blow them. The twisted trunks were like a demon that was ferociously looking at him. Dean retracted his eyes and let the undead speed up. 10 miles, 20 miles, 30 miles. Dean calculated the distance under his feet while walking. After walking straight forward for more than 40 miles, he saw a glimmer of light in the trees in front of the forest. It didn't take long for the trees at the end of the forest to shrink into the soil, revealing a vast plain. There were scattered trees and a lake on the plain. The lake was as calm as a mirror, reflecting the blue sky. Dean was relieved. He had finally come out of that place. No one had ever been able to return from the forest of despair. He should be the first to come out of it, and all the credit was due to the piece of flesh on the corpse of the goddess. Dean let the undead stop, then put on a plastic glove, dug out the piece of flesh from the back of its neck, and sealed it in a box. Now that he had stepped into the abyss, he might encounter a terrifying existence that was interested in the corpse of the goddess at any time. The piece of flesh of the goddess could be described as a double-edged sword. If it was not used well, he would die without a burial place. Although the piece of flesh had been dug out, the strong unpleasant smell still remained on the neck of the undead. Dean let it continue to move forward. He noticed the lake on the plain. According to the knowledge he learned when he was a scavenger, where there was water, there would be beast. Such a simple truth was applicable to the low-level hunters' area, and it was also applicable to the terrifying abyss. Dean's eyes entered the state of X-ray vision and glanced at the lake. He suddenly found that the lake was dark and deep. In the depths of the lake, there was a faint red shimmer. His heart shivered. This red shimmer was a heat source. Although the heat was weak and the density was very low, similar to that of ordinary cattle and sheep, its area was appalling. Looking at it from a kilometer away, he felt that its diameter was about 50 meters. The specific size might be even more terrifying. What made Dean surprised was that there seemed to be no other heat source in the lake except for this huge heat source. It seemed that there was only one creature. Dean didn't dare to approach it. He controlled the undead to bypass the lake and walk past it. The creature in the lake didn't seem to be aware of Dean. There was no movement. Dean walked thousands of meters away from the lake. When he walked past it, he saw a few huge footprints on the ground leading to the lake. He stood in the footprints pit, feeling as wide as standing alone in a square. Dean's face was ugly. He walked slowly and carefully. He held his breath and suppressed the heat in his body. He suddenly had a trace of regret. He shouldn't have taken the risk to cross the abyss. But soon, he extinguished the germination of the idea of retreat. After bypassing the lake, Dean walked along the plain for more than 10 miles. He saw a huge skeleton, like a rhinoceros. The corpse seemed to have died not long ago. It exuded a strong smell of revenge. The flesh was gnawed and blurred. But the thing that killed it didn't seem to have a big appetite. It didn't completely eat the body. Dean looked at it with his X-ray vision and found that all the internal organs were gone. The body was empty. Dean took Aisha's hand and quickly left the place. He didn't want to attract other monsters to bump into him because of the smell of the corpse. After walking for less than 5 or 6 miles, Dean met a rock-scale python entrenched in the grass of the plain. The python was 20 meters long, thicker than a water tank, and its scales were extremely tough. When it wrapped around its prey, it could exert dozens of tons of strangulation power. Chapter 8:22. The rock-scale python quickly noticed Dean's presence. Its body, which was originally coiled on the ground, slowly moved. Its huge head was slightly raised, revealing itself from the grass. Its green vertical pupils stared coldly at Dean. It flicked its forked tongue and slowly arched its head in a defensive posture, as if it would launch an attack at any time. Whoosh! Dean rapidly approached like a hideous monster made of sharp blades. His strangely twisted blades moved on the ground, propelling his body forward at an extremely fast speed. It was as if all the blades on his body could be turned into legs and feet. His speed was extremely fast, about 3 times that of a normal human body. In the blink of an eye, he rushed to the front of the rock-scale python. He looked at the swaying head of the rock-scale python and suddenly dashed to the left. The rock-scale python's reaction was extremely fast. It quickly opened its mouth to bite Dean's left side. But after Dean stepped out, his body instantly twisted, and all his blade-like limbs scratched the ground, abruptly stopping his direction, and evaded to the side, dodging the bloody mouth of the rock-scale python. At the same time, when the snake's mouth brushed past him, the sharp blades on Dean's arms instantly pierced out, cutting the edge of the snake's mouth. Puff! The dark red scales that seemed to be soaked in blood were suddenly cut open, and blood flowed out. Seeing that he could break its scales, Dean's heart calmed down. All his blade-like limbs quickly stirred, and the blade-like limbs pierced the body of the rock-scale python like nails, driving his body to quickly climb to about 7 inches on its back. This position was the place where the rock-scale python's head could not turn around to bite him. A few bloody holes appeared on the body of the rock-scale python. It was in so much pain that it went crazy. It shook its head hard, trying to shake off Dean, but to no avail. On the contrary, Dean firmly hooked its body with his blade-like limbs, and vigorously waved his arms, cutting the flesh and scales on its back until blood flowed out. The rock-scale python's huge body twisted wildly in pain, shaking the ground slightly. It turned its head toward its body and used its body to squeeze Dean on its back. Dean did not dare to neglect. He quickly used his blade-like limbs to cut a bloody hole. When the rock-scale python squeezed with its body, he immediately jumped into the bloody hole and drilled inside. Not long after, the rock-scale python gradually stopped struggling and laid on the ground. Its head weakly stretched out from its body and slithered forward in a serpentine manner. It slowly raised its head and crawled forward, as if it wanted to drag its heavy body away. However, after swimming for 7 or 8 meters, it slowly stopped. Its head hit the ground and it no longer moved. From the back of the rock-scale python's neck, Dean crawled out like a bloody man. His blade-like limbs were stained with blood, looking particularly ferocious. He shook off the bloodstains on his body and jumped down from the rock-scale python's body to the middle part. He used his blade-like limbs to cut its belly and drilled inside. After a moment, he walked out from inside with a kettle-sized snake gallbladder. The gallbladder of the rock-scale python was the main ingredient of the top antidote. If taken directly, it could detoxify most of the snake venom. Even if one was not poisoned, he could still take it to greatly enhance his resistance to poison. After taking the gallbladder, Dean came to the front of its head, opened its mouth, and broke the 4 sharp fangs in its mouth. Generally, the teeth of snakes were relatively fragile, so most of them hunted for food by swallowing them. But the rock-scale python was different. Its teeth could be said to be the hardest part of its body, and they were excellent materials for forging magic weapons. Although he had the demon hunter tool and did not lack offensive weapons, these fangs were suitable to be used as trap materials. After taking these 2 treasures, Dean glanced at the completely dead rock-scale python. He sighed in his heart. This was the wilderness. When they met, it was either to kill the other or to be killed by the other. There was no unnecessary nonsense or words. The loser would die. He picked up the 4 dagger-length fangs and carried them on his back. The gallbladder was stored in a sealed jar in case it was poisoned. Although there were a lot of valuable things on the body of the rock-scale python, Dean's backpack had limited space. He was too lazy to take things that would not play a big role in crossing the abyss. I didn't expect to see such a thing in the outermost part of the abyss. Dean carried the backpack, put away the demon hunter tool, and continued to move forward with Aisha. His heart was heavy. Although the first battle was victorious, only he knew the danger of the previous battle. If his reaction was a little slower, perhaps he would have died at the moment. In the blink of an eye, the body of the rock-scale python was left behind. Dean went all the way forward. Before long, he met 2 undeads wandering on the plain. The appearance of these 2 undeads was extremely strange. Although they were called undeads, they were more like the drawings of the Bugman that Dean had seen in the materials of the monster laboratory. One of the undeads was in the shape of a spider. Its body was lying on its stomach, and its buttocks were swollen. There were 4 or 5 sharp legs under its abdomen. The appearance was the color of human skin, but the shape of the legs only had 3 toes, and each toe was extremely long and as sharp as a dagger. The body of the other undeads was bent backward. It seemed that its spine had been crushed. Its chest was facing the sky, and its head and buttocks were about to collide. There was a huge crack in its chest, and the shadow inside was full of sharp teeth. Dean had never seen such an undead's in the monster atlas. He was afraid. After all, it was an undead's that survived in the abyss. Just looking at its shape, it was very unusual. He glanced at Aisha, hesitated, and decided to take the risk and give it a try. He threw a stone to attract the spider-like undeads and let Aisha control it. After the spider-like undeads quickly crawled in, Aisha stepped forward and growled. Her crystal-like pupils seemed to glow with a strange light. At this moment, she was no longer the usual silent and sluggish appearance. She seemed to be a god standing above all things, with a kind of ferocious and evil aura. The body of the spider-like undeads suddenly stopped. The disheveled head was full of ferocity, but there was obvious fear in its eyes. Its mouth was slightly closed, and its body was shaking. It slowly lay down to show submission. Dean was relieved in his heart. At the same time, he was once again shocked by Aisha's control. He didn't expect that even the undeads living in the abyss could not resist the control of the Corpse King. Moreover, this control seemed to come from instinct. What was it that made these unconscious undeads instinctively afraid of the Corpse King? Dean felt that the undeads must be hiding incredible big secrets, but this was not what he could figure out at present. After controlling the undeads, Dean did the same and attracted the cracked chest undead. Aisha took action and easily controlled it again. Dean was satisfied. Now there were 2 undeads as stepping stones. It was good. Moreover, these 2 undeads were fast. It was estimated that they could compete with the masters of the war god level, or even win. After controlling the 2 undeads, Dean continued to move forward. After walking for 40 or 50 miles, Dean once again met a few monsters like giant rat. The heat intensity was not high, just at the limitless level, but the appearance of the giant rats, coupled with such power, seemed a bit terrifying. Dean controlled the 2 undeads to kill several giant rats and then continued to move forward. As he went deeper and deeper, Dean found that the landforms of the abyss were very different. Sometimes it was a plain with tall weeds, and sometimes it was an arid desert. In the desert there were small areas of swamps like rain pit. There were a lot of strange creatures hidden in them. Dean saw them with his X-ray vision and avoided them in advance. It seems that although the monsters in the abyss are strong, the number is not as dense as in the wasteland. Dean thought in his heart. Along the way, he did not encounter many monsters and undeads, but all the monsters were strong. Few of them were below the level of pioneers. For those pioneers in the wasteland, this was undoubtedly a world of death. As long as they encountered a monster, it may be a life and death struggle. In addition to the first rock python he met, Dean walked for hundreds of miles but didn't meet any other Dominator-level monsters. However, he didn't dare to relax his vigilance. The giant wall didn't record how long the abyss area was. It was possible that the road he was walking now was just the border of the abyss area. Wall Lord returns from the kingdom of God to the giant wall once every 10 years. He only returns once every 10 years. I don't know how long the journey will be, Dean thought in his heart. He suddenly thought of the journey to the west that he had read when he was a child. He smiled bitterly in his heart. He felt that he was now like Tang Seng in the journey to the west. He had to travel through mountains and rivers to obtain scriptures. He did not know how many monsters would he meet on the way. What was more sad was that he was not like Tang Seng, who had a relationship with Sun Wukong at the beginning. He could only rely on himself and Aisha. Thinking of Aisha, he looked at her and suddenly felt balanced in his heart. She was enough. In the blink of an eye, he had been in the abyss for 3 days. Dean walked during the day and only rushed during the day. Even so, he had walked nearly 200 miles. As he gradually went deeper into the abyss, his original idea was gradually broken. The number of monsters he met along the way was increasing. Huge corpses of monsters could be seen everywhere. Their skin and bones were still there, but they were hanging like rags. When he came to the foot of a gloomy mountain, Dean suddenly stopped. His eyes fell on a huge claw print. This claw print was about 6 to 7 meters long and 3 meters wide. It was not difficult to imagine how huge the owner of this claw print was. But Dean had seen countless claw prints of this size along the way. But this time he could not move his eyes away. Because there was a person embedded in the claw print. A normal-sized person. Dean hadn't seen a normal human since he came to the abyss, except for Aisha, who was next to him. Even the undeads had mutated into an extremely ferocious appearance. They were half human and half beast. It was difficult to distinguish them. The person in the paw print was facing the ground, pressed down by the paw print. It seemed that the monster in the paw print had stepped on him. However, the monster did not seem to notice the person, or perhaps it thought that the person was too small and was too lazy to pick him up to eat, so the person just lay there in the paw print. Chapter 8:23. He used his sharp limbs to dig the body out of the soil. It was a man with flaxen hair and a western face from the old era. He had a high nose and deep eye sockets. His face was pale and the blood that overflowed from his mouth and nose had covered most of his face. The blood stains had long dried up. There were no injuries on his body. It seemed that he was suffocated to death by being pressed alive. Dean looked at the clothes on his body. The upper body was an animal skin. There was a string of vertical bones hanging from his neck. There was an oval scale sewn on the chest of the animal skin. It seemed to be used to defend against frontal attacks. He was holding a conical fong in his hand. The handle was rough and the tip was sharp. In addition, there was a water bag and backpack on his back. But they had long been flattened. This primitive dress made Dean's heart ripple. It reminded him of the barbarians who were banished to the radiation zone of the outer wall. Did it mean that there was a group of barbarians in the world outside the wall? Judging from the rancid smell of the corpse, it should be less than 2 days since he died. Dean used his sharp limbs to cut open the corpse. He looked at the bone density. It wasn't hard. It was estimated that it was comparable to a senior hunter. Such strength in the abyss was as small as a reptile. He would become food for any monster. But such a small existence unexpectedly appeared here. Dean couldn't imagine how he survived here. Of course, he couldn't use the word survive to describe it. But it was not difficult to see from the dirty body and the dense dust in his hair and pores that he had lived in the harsh conditions of the wilderness for a long time. It was likely that he was born and raised here. There are people living in the abyss. Moreover, it isn't an abyss walker. It's such a weak person. They must have a special way to hide here and know how to avoid the monsters here. Dean's heart suddenly became hot. If he could find these people and learn from them how to survive in the abyss, it would certainly help to improve his success rate of crossing the abyss. Thinking of this, his mind suddenly became active. He carefully examined the things on the body and opened the bag that was flattened. There were some leaves and flowers inside, but they were all flattened. In addition, there was also the corpse of an insect wrapped in a cloth that had been pressed into a pulp. Dean saw the insect's corpse. He thought of the mythical worm. But the insect's corpse didn't emit the slightest smell of mythical worm powder. He thought about it and put away the bug's body. He also put away his backpack. He searched the body again, but he didn't find anything that could help him avoid the monster. After pondering for a moment, he squatted down and took the vertical bone necklace from his neck. Then, he dug a deep pit and buried the corpse. After doing this, he raised his head and looked around. He saw many red dots among the flowers. They were about the length of a finger. They were the poisonous insects in the jungle. They could easily climb onto him when he was moving through the jungle. In addition, there were no other large heat reactions. This person's strength is low. He shouldn't dare to move too far away from his residence. He came out to look for food. A hunter's footsteps won't be too fast. His residence should be nearby. Dean thought. He took Aisha and controlled the two undeads to open the way in front. He was ready to search within a radius of 100 miles around the corpse. He walked very cautiously, always observing the heat reaction within his field of vision. It must be known that this person died not long ago, but he was trampled to death by the huge footprint, indicating that the owner of the footprint was likely to be wandering nearby. Dean followed the footprint forward. Along the way, he saw a lot of traces of trees being trampled flat and some monsters being trampled to death. After walking for 7 or 8 miles, Dean finally saw the owner of the footprint. Looking from afar, it was like a 20 to 30 meters hill crawling on the wasteland. Its whole body was dark and hairy. It was like a lump of fat meat curled up together. At the moment, it seemed to be resting and sleeping. Dean didn't dare to go forward and disturb it. The intensity of the heat source emitted by this thing was the most terrifying he had seen so far. It was more than twice the intensity of the rock-scale python he had seen before. It was estimated that it was at the peak of the sovereign level. Fortunately, this thing seemed to be sleeping soundly and didn't move at all. Dean didn't dare to stay any longer. He controlled the two undeads to take a detour and leave from another place. Dean searched around the mountain where the man's body was buried. In addition to the huge mountain of meat monster, he also met 2 monsters of the same level as the rock-scale python. But he avoided them and didn't notice them. After all, compared with these monsters, he was too small. Even if the ordinary monsters noticed him, they wouldn't be interested in hunting him. It was the same as a lion not catching ants and bugs to eat. Moreover, Dean's breath was restrained, and the heat he emitted was extremely low. In addition, he was smeared with Walking Dead powder, so he could disguise himself as an undead. Therefore, the 3 sovereign monsters he met on the way did not take the initiative to chase him. On the contrary, some monsters of the pioneer level or even lower level directly chased him and the 2 undeads he controlled. Dean didn't show any mercy to these monsters who could be killed in an instant. After quickly killing them, he immediately turned to other places, so as not to attract more monsters and cause unnecessary trouble. On the 3rd day, Dean came to a lake. The lake was blue and vast. Seeing such a pure water lake, Dean suddenly understood. No wonder he followed the trace to this place. It was not surprising that there were people living in a place with such a pure water source. In the past 3 days, he searched everywhere. Although he didn't meet the man's companions, he found some footprints of their companions. The reason why he judged these footprints belonged to their companions was because the shape of the footprints was similar. He remembered the shape of the man's boots, and these footprints were made by the same boot. The number of footprints was messy, big and small, indicating that there were more than 1 or 2 people. Dean found at least 8 people from the footprints. Chapter 8:24. Dean took Aisha and hid in the grass by the lake. He let the 2 undeads lie down in another patch of grass, converged their scent, and waited. In the blink of an eye, it was dusk. Another day was about to pass. In the wilderness, the number of days seemed meaningless. There was only the difference between day and night. When the night was coming, the monsters would come out of their nests, and danger would come. Dean took out the empty water bag from his backpack, quietly got up, and went to the lake, ready to scoop water to drink at night. As soon as he squatted down by the lake, he had a creepy feeling in his heart. Soon, he found something strange. At this moment, the sun was shining on the lake, but the lake was still blue, and the color had not changed much. His face changed slightly, and his heart became vigilant. He stepped back 10 steps, picked up the stone on the ground, and threw it into the lake. The stone fell into the lake, splashing waves. The next moment, Dean saw the whole blue lake was like a huge piece of skin, suddenly wrinkled, and in the blink of an eye, rippled like boiling water. Looking closely, he saw countless diamond-shaped fish flipping at the bottom of the lake, jumping toward the stone. Soon, these blue fish found that the stone was not food, and they calmed down. Then the rippling lake water also calmed down, and the whole lake became mirror-like blue again. The fish seemed to disappear in this blue. Seeing such a change, Dean felt a chill in his heart. His heat source vision did not detect that the lake was densely covered with so many small fish. These blue fish had no heat source reaction. They gathered together and were motionless, like pure water. It was almost difficult to distinguish them. But if he had rashly stretched out his hand to scoop the water, he would have touched these small fish. With the fierce reaction of these small fish, most likely they would have jumped up and pounced on him to attack. Dean's face changed, but he slowly retreated back to the grass. He put the water bag into his backpack. Although these small fishes didn't seem to be strong, he didn't want to provoke them. After all, some monsters were weak and small, but they were highly toxic. For example, the poison dart frog inside the giant wall was enough to kill a ruler. Although he had a way to avoid these small fishes and get the lake water, it was difficult to know if the lake water was a normal water source. "I can only wait for it to rain," Dean said in his heart. At the same time, he was a little glad that he had not acted in the wilderness for too long. He had been fighting to usurp power in the giant wall, so he had neglected the life outside the giant wall. Gradually, the sun went down and the sound of insects rose. In the middle of the night, there was a loud roar in the distance. It seemed that a giant beast was coming, and each step was a loud sound. Dean squatted in the grass and saw a huge figure with a strong heat source. It was nearly 10 meters high, like a giant bull. It walked to the lake and stretched its head into the lake to drink. At the place where it was drinking, the water surged as if it was boiling. Countless small blue fish were jumping around, but the monster swallowed all of them in one gulp along with the water. After drinking for more than 10 minutes, the giant bull-like monster was still gulping water. It did not have the slightest intention to stop. At this moment, Dean suddenly saw an extremely dark blue long line erected on the lake. It seemed to be the back of something, about 7 or 8 meters long. It was slowly swimming towards the giant bull monster. When it swam more than 50 meters away from it, the dark blue long shadow gradually sank into the water and disappeared. Dean tried to use his heat source vision to see, but found that the latter was also a cold-blooded creature without heat source reaction. Whoosh! Suddenly, in less than 2 seconds, water sprayed out from the bottom of the bull monster's bloody mouth, and a strange dark blue fish jumped out of the water. This strange fish did not have fins under its abdomen, but sharp claws. Its body was flat and long like a ribbonfish, and there were vertical spikes like gears on its back. At this moment, it suddenly pounced and instantly wrapped around the head of the bull monster like a blue ribbon. The giant bull monster roared angrily. Its hooves stepped high on the lake, splashing sand and stones into the lake. Its body quickly retreated to the back of the lake, violently shaking its head. The dark blue strange fish saw that it was about to retreat from the lake, and immediately released its head and retreated back into the water. The giant bull-like monster continuously retreated dozens of meters, but still had a look of lingering fear. It panted and roared, as if it was unwilling to show off. Then it turned its head and slowly turned away. On the other hand, the strange dark blue fish swam by the lake for a moment, then slowly swam towards the center of the lake, gradually sinking to the bottom of the lake. Everything returned to normal, and in the cold night, it was as if nothing had happened. Dean was surprised. He didn't expect that in addition to the small fish, there was also the previous terrifying strange fish. The giant bull-like monster's heat source reaction was at the dominator level, but it didn't dare to entangle with the strange fish. A few hours later, Dean heard the roars of monsters coming from the distance. It seemed that several monsters were fighting. Dean half squinted his eyes. He was on guard while cultivating his spirit. He had long been accustomed to the night scene in the wilderness. It was not like the inside of the giant wall where the rich nightlife had just begun. There was only cold scenery and monsters here. Unknowingly, it was dawn. At dawn, Dudian was sleepy and ready to take a nap. Suddenly, He heard a subtle sound of footsteps coming from the distance. He turned his head and saw two figures coming from the bushes in the distance. It was the figure of two humans. Dean's eyes lit up. Finally, they appeared outside the giant wall. The intensity of the heat source of these two people wasn't high. One was a senior hunter and the other was a primary limitless. Both of them were extremely cautious. They walked and stopped to observe the movements around them. From time to time they squatted down and picked up the soil on the ground to sniff. Dean held back the excitement in his heart as he secretly observed. After a while, the two of them carefully groped their way to the edge of the blue lake. They raised their heads and looked around. After seeing that there was nothing strange, the two of them seemed to relax a little. They grabbed the spears on their backs and went to a shallow spot by the lake. They looked into the water and then fiercely stabbed the spears into the water. With a splash, the spears pierced into the water, and the bottom of the water immediately churned violently. The man quickly looked up and saw a small blue fish on the spear. It was struggling. Its vitality was extremely tenacious. Chapter 8:25. Blue light surged on the surface of the lake, and a large number of blue fish gathered in the shallow water in front of the two men's feet. The two men seemed to know the habits of these blue fish very well, so they didn't panic. They were still steadily stabbing the fish with the spear. The other man was carrying the fish in the bag. In the process, the two looked up at the lake from time to time, as if afraid of something. Dean thought of the strange fish he saw last night. He thought that if the strange fish swam over, the two of them would most likely suffer. Thinking of this, he suddenly changed his mind. Wasn't this just an opportunity to get to know them? If he rashly came forward, it would inevitably arouse the vigilance of these people. But if it was a life-saving grace, it was undoubtedly the fastest way to enter the other side. However, looking at the vigilance of the two men, they were already prepared. Counting on the strange fish to attack them, the chances were slim. He soon had an idea. He shook the bell in Aisha's ear very slightly. Aisha heard the sound and controlled the two undeads in the distance to climb up from the grass and swim towards the two men by the lake. The two men by the lake moved quickly. In the blink of an eye, they had stabbed more than a dozen fish. They were about to turn and leave, but saw two ferocious undeads coming out of the woods. The two men were scared and pale. The man with the spear quickly reacted. He took out a handful of powder from his backpack and patted it on his body. At the same time, he patted the powder on his companion's back and pointed to the fish in his companion's hand. The companion was stunned for a moment. There was a trace of reluctance in his heart, but he quickly put the fish in the bag on the ground. Then the two men slowly moved to the side. Dean smelled the smell of the undead powder. He couldn't help but feel a trace of interest. They actually knew how to make undead powder to avoid the undead. No wonder they could survive in the abyss. However, he let Aisha control the two undeads and walked straight towards the two men. At the moment, the two men had moved to the other side like thieves. The middle-aged man with the spear was very nervous. He held his companion's hand tightly to calm him down. But the next moment, the two undeads didn't look at the fish bag on the ground and directly rushed to the two men. The middle-aged man's pupils constricted in fear. Run! With that, he turned around and ran. However, their speed could not be compared with the two pioneer-level walking corpses. In the blink of an eye, the roar of the two people was approaching from behind. The hysterical and hoarse roar made the two people's hair stand up and their scalps numb. The blood of the whole body seemed to flow backward in their brains. Their hearts were beating wildly. They only felt that death was approaching infinitely. But in the next moment, the two of them saw a figure in ferocious armor suddenly jump out from the bushes in front of them, holding a black broadsword and charging straight at them. The two of them were dumbfounded. They didn't expect to see other humans here and couldn't wrap their heads around it. In the next moment, Dean passed by the two men and waved his broadsword to meet the two undeads behind them. He didn't kill them directly, but deliberately fell into guerrilla warfare. At the same time, he maintained the upper hand, so as not to be in a disadvantageous position and scare the two directly away. After all, it was the norm in this wilderness to not help others. The two men turned their heads and saw Dean fighting fiercely with the two undeads. The panic in their hearts was slightly stabilized. Soon they saw the situation of victory tilting towards Dean's side. In the joint attack of the two undeads, Dean performed with ease, but occasionally it was somewhat thrilling. After 2 minutes of guerrilla warfare, Dean drilled a gap and beheaded one of the blade undead. The splitting sword directly cut off its head. After killing one undead, the remaining one was also killed by Dean's broadsword in the blink of an eye. Dean exhaled lightly and forced out hot sweat. He turned to the two men, wiped the blood on the broadsword, and put it away to show that he was not hostile. The two men were relieved to see that Dean was not malicious. The middle-aged man reached out to his chest and said gratefully, "Thank you for your help. My name is Prelay. What's your name?" When he asked, he looked at Dean with respect and curiosity, especially the hideous armor on Dean's body, which made his eyes a bit envious. Dean was surprised to hear his language. It was English. At the same time, he was relieved. If it was another language, it would be very troublesome to communicate. He quietly observed the two men. From their expressions, there was no rejection and vigilance, indicating that his plan was half successful. He said in English, "My name is Dean. It's safe here. They were all killed by me." He didn't directly ask the identity of the two men, but inadvertently repeated the previous things to increase the impression in their hearts. Hearing Dean's words, Prelay glanced at the two heads of the undeads rolling behind Dean's feet. The gratitude in his eyes was even more intense. He said, "Thank you for your help. Without you, we would have been dead." "It's nothing. Don't mention it," Dean said. At this time, the dawn shone from behind Dean. Prilay's face slightly changed as if he was awakened. He said to Dean, "Mr. Dean, the night is coming. It's very dangerous here. Would you like to go back to the camp with us? I want to thank you for saving our lives." "Me too." His companion, who had a few crooked scars on his face, said with sincerity. Dean felt strange. Wasn't it safer to come during the day? How could it be dangerous? He didn't ask much. He nodded. "Okay, wait for me. I have a friend. I'll ask her to come with us." Prelay was stunned. There was a trace of hesitation in his eyes. At this time, Dean had turned to the grass. He pulled Aisha up and said to the two men, "Let's go." Prelay glanced at Aisha, and a trace of amazement flashed in his eyes. Although Aisha was wearing a veil, but he could still see the flawless outline of her cheek. Moreover, her white skin and graceful figure were out of place in the surrounding environment. Okay, Prelay nodded. He secretly swallowed his saliva and said to his companion, "Go and get the fish." He took out a bag from his backpack and picked up the two undead's heads from the ground. He put them into the bag and handed it to Dean. "This is your loot," Dean said. "It's for you." Prelay was startled. He didn't expect Dean to give him such a precious thing. He stared at him. "For me? Really?" "Really." Prelay couldn't help but be excited. He held the two heads in his arms and thanked Dean again and again. His companion came over with the fish bag. He looked at him with envy. "Old Prelay, this thing can be your heirloom." Chapter 8:26. Dean held Aisha's hand and followed the two back the way they came. After walking for 7 or 8 miles, they came to a canyon separated by 2 mountains. Dean had been here before when he went to the lake. He had seen the footprints of Prelay and the other abyss dwellers, but he didn't find any traces of habitation. At this moment, Prelay stopped in front of the canyon and seemed to be looking at something. After a moment, he came to a rock and gently tapped it with the spear in his hand. Dean was surprised to see his action. His pupils flashed and he instantly saw through the rock. The rock was extremely thick, about 3 meters in diameter. Behind the rock was a deep tunnel. Rumble! After Prelay tapped 6 times, the rock slowly rolled, revealing a gap. Prelay motioned to Dean and took the lead to go in. Dean pulled Aisha and drilled into the crevice of the rock. As soon as he stepped into the tunnel, he saw 2 burly men with strange paint standing behind the stone. He was surprised because he didn't see these 2 men when he used his X-ray vision to observe. The 2 giants froze on the spot when they saw Dean and Aisha behind Prelay. It took a few seconds for them to react. They immediately took their axes from the rock wall and pointed at Dean with vigilance. Prelay quickly said, "Wilderness generals, he is the savior of me and Poke. He has no malice." The 2 giants looked at him and examined Dean and Aisha for a moment. Their eyes lingered on Aisha for a while, but they quickly retracted their eyes. One of the giants with a bird tattoo said, "You 2 fools! You actually brought outsiders back without authorization. Do you want to bring disaster to the camp?" Prelay smiled. "How could it be? He has no malice." The bird-tattooed giant snorted as he looked at Dean. "I hope you will leave as soon as possible because of your kindness to them." Dean didn't expect to be stopped here. Naturally, he couldn't retreat. He looked unhappy. "Is this how you treat your benefactor? Now that the night is coming and it's so dangerous outside, you want me to leave? Isn't it the same as asking me to die? So what's the difference between you and killing me?" His words were based on the previous words of Prelay. Although he didn't know what danger the night was coming, but since Prelay was in such a hurry to return, it was obvious that there was a powerful character coming out. The bird-tattooed giant was startled when he heard Dean speak their language. He looked at Dean in surprise but soon frowned. "I don't care where you come from. We have treated you well by not killing you. You have saved them. Prelay, give him the fish that you have hunted and we will repay the kindness. Outsider, leave quickly or don't blame me for being impolite." Dean slightly bowed his head. There was a trace of killing intent in his eyes, but it quickly disappeared. He turned to Prelay. "I'm leaving. I hope you can live well. The area around the lake is dangerous. Don't go fishing there in the future." Prelay's heart was burning as he heard Dean's words. He couldn't help but turn to the bird-tattooed giant. "General Bird, they are our benefactors. We have always been grateful. Now that the night is here, letting him leave is tantamount to sending him to his death. I'm going to report to the great priest and let her decide." The bird-tattooed giant's face was gloomy. "Even if you talk to the great priest, she won't agree to let him in." "I'm going to try," Prelay resolutely said. The bird-tattooed giant frowned and was silent for a moment. He looked at Dean. "You stay here. Prelay, you will be severely punished if you disturb the great priest. I'll give you a quarter of an hour. If you don't reply then I'll immediately expel them." Prelay nodded and looked at Dean. "Mr. Dean, wait for me here. I'll be back soon." Then he looked at Dean and quickly ran into the tunnel. Dean looked at Prelay's back, but his eyes quickly entered magic pupil state. His field of vision quickly extended. He saw that the sand and stones in the dark tunnel were clearly visible, extending all the way to the bottom. In the blink of an eye, Prelay's figure disappeared without a trace. At the end of the tunnel, he couldn't see any heat source. Dean didn't look at it and quietly withdrew his eyes. "Mr. Dean, I'll accompany you," Prelay's companion said. Dean nodded to him. "Thank you." In the blink of an eye, 10 minutes passed. Dean silently calculated the time. There were still 3 minutes before the quarter hour. He saw Prelay's figure appear at the end of the tunnel. He was panting, and his expression seemed to be very happy. Dean was relieved to see his expression. "Bird General, the great priest said that I'll take them to see her." Prelay panted and raised a piece of brocade cloth in his hand. The word God was embroidered on it. The bird-tattooed giant and the lion-tattooed giant's face changed as they saw the brocade cloth. They raised their hands to cover their chest and knelt on one knee. "We will obey the god's order." Dean looked at the brocade cloth but didn't say anything. He nodded to the 2 giants and turned to follow Prelay into the depths of the tunnel. "What is the great priest?" Dean asked Prelay. Priley's face showed a pious look. The great priest is the great priest. She is the greatest person here. We follow the instructions of the great priest to survive in this evil land. Dean's eyes lit up. It seemed that the great priest was their leader. However, a person like Prelay was able to meet the great priest. It showed that the number of survivors here wasn't that large. If it was a tribe of hundreds of thousands of survivors, then the leader wouldn't be able to meet in 10 minutes. The number of people here was likely to be less than 3,000 or even less. Dean was a bit at ease after speculating about the situation here. But he still had a trace of fear as he couldn't see the two wilderness generals with his X-ray vision. He didn't know the reason why. Chapter 8:27. Soon, an underground village appeared in front of Dean. Houses with strange shapes were built with rock. They were simple and rough. There were weeds filling the gaps. There were several barefoot children running on the path. Most of them had flaxen or brown hair color. There were bowl-sized lamps on the rock wall above the village, exuding light like the halo of an electric bulb. Dean was surprised. He did not expect that there were humans living underground, and there were a lot of them. The strangest thing was that compared with the rough houses on the ground, the lights above their heads were electric lights, not special crystals or firefly pebbles. Uncle Prelay. A few children who were playing saw Prelay coming out of the tunnel and immediately gathered around him, chattering, "Uncle Prelay, did you catch any fish today? Can you take me outside next time?" Uncle Prelay, who is this brother and sister? They are dressed so strangely. Wow, are these weapons made of magic iron? Priley's face was full of smiles and was extremely kind. He said, "This brother and sister are outsiders. I'm going to bring them to see the great priest. I'll tell you all when I return. You guys go play first. Be obedient." People from the outside? Wow! People from the outside? Several children's eyes lit up as they heard his words. They curiously looked at Dean and Aisha. Prelay pushed away several children and led Dean to move forward. They passed several rough houses built with rock. Some houses had dried bacon hanging in front of them. People came out and greeted Prelay with a smile. Some asked him about today's harvest. But soon they were attracted by Dean and Aisha. When asked, Prelay told the truth. It attracted a lot of people's attention. Some showed curiosity. Some lost the smile in their eyes. They looked at Dean and Aisha in horror. They leaned against the door and seemed ready to hide in the house at any time. Dean saw the different expressions of these people. He thought of the words of the general stationed outside the tunnel. His heart sank. He expected that they had encountered outsiders and extremely bad things happened here. However, from the performance of these children and Prelay, this kind of thing happened a long time ago. Time will wear away the memory of some people. Even the next generation will forget the hatred of their homeland. This was the sorrow of human nature, but at this moment Dudian was lucky. At least from the innocent and curious expressions of the children, he could see that they were not afraid of him, an outsider. It was likely that they didn't understand the bad things that had happened to outsiders in the past. Along the way, they passed through dozens of houses. Dean roughly noticed that there were more than 200 people. It didn't take long for them to reach the center of the village. There was an empty miniature square of 200 square meters. Dean was completely stunned when he saw the things in front of the square. He couldn't believe it and was astonished. A steep, sloping ladder extended from midair to the ground. The ladder was made entirely of metal, dark silver in color, and was extremely restrained and high-end. The top of the ladder was connected to an oval metal ball that was suspended in midair. It was shaped like a coconut, and it could probably hold hundreds of people inside. Dean slowly looked up. He found that the elliptical metal ball wasn't completely suspended in the air. There were several extremely thick black iron pillars that were connected to the top of the rock wall. Prelay saw Dean's stunned expression. He gently smiled. "Mr. Dean, the great priest is waiting for you. Please come with me." Don't be too casual when you see the great priest. She is the greatest person in the world. Dean recovered and nodded. He turned to lead the way in front. He couldn't help but use his X-ray vision. He found that the inside of the elliptical metal ball was dark red. What surprised him was that the scene he saw was exactly the same as when he saw through Sylvia's coffin. The elliptical metal ball seemed to be made of the same material as Sylvia's coffin. There were stairs hanging down from the top. It looked like stairs leading to an airplane. There were two giant men with strange monster tattoos guarding the stairs. Dudian knew that they were wilderness generals. His eyes were attracted by a tall statue next to the square. His pupils shrank. The statue was more than 10 meters high. Its upper body was that of a human, but its lower body was that of a ferocious spider. This half-human, half-beast body reminded him of Sylvia again, and this person was also a woman, breathtakingly beautiful. When he saw Sylvia, he thought that she was the most perfect face in the world, but when he saw this woman, he felt that the two were equally matched. This woman's beauty had another kind of temperament, more heroic and alternative charm. This is our great Aragami. Prelay saw Dean stop and turned around. He smiled at Dean. Aragami has been protecting us for hundreds of years. It is reasonable to say that we should salute the Aragami. But you are an outsider. It is not too late to salute the Aragami after you have seen the great priest. Dean retracted his eyes, but his heart was in turmoil. There was a statue of the god of war in this small village, outside the giant wall. Moreover, it seemed that the god of war was half human and half beast. But why was the god of war in the wilderness of the abyss while Sylvia was in the giant wall? Did the people here used to live in the giant wall but later migrated out? He felt that there should be a lot of secret. He nodded and continued to move forward. Halt! The two desolate generals by the side of the stairs stretched out their hands, stopping Prelay. One of them said in a cold voice, "Outsiders can't bring weapons to see the great priest." Prelay turned to Dean. "Mr. Dean, this is the rule." "Don't worry," Dean didn't finish his words. He nodded. "It's nothing. I don't mean any harm." He took off the split sword and put it on the ground. Then he took off the blood vessel from Haisha's back and put it together. He returned to the front of the two wilderness generals. "I don't like others to touch my weapon. I hope you can take care of it for me." The two wilderness generals nodded slightly. "Please." Dean and Prelay immediately went up the stairs. Chapter 828. Whoosh. The metal door slowly rose, and a woman's body fragrance floated out from inside. Dean's heart slightly moved. He was more and more convinced that there was electricity here, but the rough rock house outside seemed to be completely incompatible with the technological level of electricity. He glanced into the cabin and saw a bright red carpet covering the entire aisle. The inside was very spacious, and the walls were emitting holes, illuminating the magnificent interior. Everywhere was bright and luxurious. Prelay bowed his head and took off his shoes. He walked in quietly. Dean didn't wait for Prelay's order. He also took off his boots and walked barefoot on the carpet. He felt that his feet were very warm and soft. It was a huge oval room. After turning the corner of the cabin door, Dean saw the other end of the room. There were several steps. Behind the steps was a curtain. A figure was sitting inside, and a pretty girl was standing in front of the curtain. She was about 14 or 15 years old. She had a pair of golden eyes, and her skin was white and tender. She was very different from the children and residents in the houses outside. Prelay greets the goddess, greets the high priestess. Prelay's face was full of respect as he bowed and knelt down on one knee. Dean didn't salute with him. He stood quietly and looked at the girl and the figure sitting behind the curtain. The thin silk curtain couldn't block his line of sight. There was an old woman in a graceful robe sitting inside. She had a kind face and white hair. She had a Westerner's face, which was somewhat similar to the girl in front of him. Dean suddenly thought that most of the residents he saw along the way seemed to have human faces from the old era of Europe and America. There were few Asian faces. This might be related to the region he was in. The girl who was called Goddess by Prelay looked at Dean curiously. Her big golden eyes flashed. Suddenly her small face turned serious. She frowned. "You two are the outsiders?" Dean nodded slightly. "Greetings to the goddess and the great priest. My name is Dean, and this is my lover, Aisha." He paused for a moment when he introduced Aisha's identity. Saying that she was his companion seemed a bit strange. But saying that she was his wife and lover didn't seem to have obtained her consent. Although he could feel her feelings, but after all, he didn't confess to her when she was alive. He didn't get her consent. But after getting along with her for so long, he had already regarded her as his other half. Even if she didn't agree, he wouldn't allow her to object because he couldn't bear to lose her again. The girl saw a flash of hesitation in Dean's eyes. She felt a bit strange. She said, "I heard that you saved Prelay? I just happened to pass by." Dean didn't dare to take credit. The girl nodded slightly and slowly stepped forward. She came less than half a meter away from Dean. She looked up at Dean. There was no trace of impurities in her pure eyes. It seemed that she wanted to see through all the secrets and shadows in Dean's heart. However, Dean had climbed all the way to the position of the wall master. He also looked down at her. His eyes were pure. There was no trace of distractions. The two looked at each other for a moment. The girl's cheeks suddenly turned red. She took back her eyes and turned to look at Aisha. Her eyebrows wrinkled. "Sister, it seems that you don't have a heartbeat?" Dean's heart shivered. But he had expected the possibility of Aisha being seen through. He immediately said, "She is suffering from a strange disease. It's better not to get too close to her. If there is anything, just tell me." The girl squinted at him. She slightly pouted and turned back to the curtain. "Where are you from?" "From a god's wall," Dean answered truthfully. The girl was startled. She didn't expect Dean to be so frank. Or it was the first time she heard about the wall. She quickly reacted and looked at the curtain. The old woman in the curtain was silent after hearing Dean's words. After a moment, she slightly nodded to the girl. The girl understood and looked at Prelay, who was still kneeling on the ground. "You go down first. The great priest wants to talk to the outsider Mr. Dean personally." Prelay respectfully replied, "Yes, Prelay will go." Then, he lowered his head and slowly walked away. Before leaving, he gave Dean a look of encouragement. After Prelay left, the girl knocked twice on the metal wall next to her. The cabin door slowly descended and closed with a click. In an instant, only Dean and the two girls were left inside. There was a trace of vigilance in Dean's heart, but on the surface he was very calm. At this time, the girl took the lead to talk to Dean. It was as if she had changed into a different person. "What is your purpose in coming here? If I'm not mistaken, the lover you spoke of is a corpse puppet, right?" There was a trace of coldness in Dean's eyes. "You can talk about me, but don't talk about her. I told you that she has a strange disease. I came here just passing by. I didn't expect to meet you here. I didn't know that there are people who can survive in this area. If I had a purpose, I would have attacked you long ago. In my opinion, are you the leaders here?" The girl sneered. "Do it? Do you think you can get out of here alive if you do it?" Dean's heart moved. He had deliberately said so, but looking at the girl's appearance, there seemed to be some kind of mechanism in the spaceship-like metal cabin. When he saw the electricity, he had no intention of using brute force to conquer this place and dig out its secret. He immediately revealed an angry expression and said, "Is this how you treat your benefactor? If you suspect me, why did you come to see me?" Seeing the anger in Dean's eyes, the coldness in the girl's eyes slowly faded. She turned to look at the old woman in the curtain. The old woman nodded to her and took out a bracelet from her sleeve. The girl immediately understood and took the bracelet from the curtain. She turned to Dean. "I was presumptuous before. We have been attacked by outsiders like you and almost destroyed. So I am more worried that you will come here with other purposes like the outsiders. It seems that you really have no intention to come here. The great priest has some questions to ask you. Please put on the bracelet. Dean looked at the pure white metal bracelet in her hand and deliberately showed a gloomy look. What is this? This is the god's bracelet. It contains the power of origami and can see through all lies. If you really have no intention to come here, please put on the bracelet. If you don't want to, please leave here. The girl said seriously. Dean frowned slightly. It was obviously impossible to leave. Moreover, she had already said it. If he didn't put it on, it would mean that he had a guilty conscience. It was tantamount to acquiescing that he came here with other purposes. Then he might not be able to leave safely. It was very likely that they would activate the mechanism in the metal cabin. The mechanism he was most worried about was the laser. Thinking of this, there was a trace of regret in his heart. He shouldn't have boarded this pirate ship. However, with the previous situation, he had no choice but to go down. He could only bite the bullet and go down. If they really fell out, he felt that he could at least kill or capture the girl and the great priest when the mechanism was activated. Moreover, it could be seen from the fact that the girl had to manually close the cabin door. Even if there was an attack mechanism here, it needed to be activated by them. After thinking for a moment, Dean agreed. Although the attitude of the other party was very tough and even overbearing, he had to yield. Who told him to come here with other purposes? Chapter 8:29. The girl looked at Dean but didn't say anything. When Dean raised his right hand, she stepped forward to put the bracelet on Dean's wrist. At this moment, Dean suddenly turned his palm into a claw and quickly grabbed her wrist. At the same time, his other hand grabbed her neck. All of this was done in an instant. In the blink of an eye, the girl was subdued by Dean and became a hostage. You! The girl's face turned pale. The old woman's face changed. She put her hand on the steps next to her. I mean no harm. Dean quickly opened his mouth and released the girl. He looked at her calmly. I just want to tell you that if I was a bad person, I would have the opportunity to capture you and then use you as a hostage to leave here. The girl was released by Dean. She rubbed her neck and coughed twice. She stepped back a few steps and looked at Dean while gnashing her teeth. You sneak attack. Dean didn't speak but looked at the old woman in the curtain. I hope my kindness can also be returned by your kindness. The old woman saw Dean release the girl. Her body also relaxed, but her eyes were obviously more dignified. The girl turned to look at the curtain. The old woman nodded slightly to her. The girl understood. She turned her head and stared at Dean. We won't hurt you. This ring is only effective against evil people. If you have good intentions, you will be fine. Dean didn't say anything and handed it to her. The girl was obviously vigilant this time. She quickly put it on Dean and then quickly returned to the curtain. Dean glanced at the ring on his wrist. The material was very light. There was a screen flashing with wavy lines. In addition, there were a few English letters next to it. This shape combined with the girl's words reminded him of the lie detector he had seen in the super chip. Did you really come to us without any malice? The girl angrily asked Dudian. It was obvious that she was still concerned about the previous matter of being captured by Dudian. Dean looked up from the ring and looked at her lovely little face. He calmly said, Of course not. I have already expressed my position. Can't there be a little basic trust between people? Well, it's useless to talk. The girl slightly pouted and said, Was it really an accident that you saved Prelay? Of course, Dean said without thinking. The girl raised her eyebrows and said, Then why did you leave your hometown and come here? Dean frowned and thought for a moment. This is my private matter. The girl snorted and said, If you don't tell me, how will I know what secrets you have? What if you're coming for us? Dean sighed. There is no harm in telling you since you don't believe me. I want to see the world outside of the wall. As you can see, my lover is suffering from a strange disease. There is no way to treat her in the wall. So I want to see if there are other people living in the outside world. I want to see if there is a way to cure her." The girl looked at him and seemed to believe him. The dissatisfaction on her face gradually disappeared. She said in a low voice, "We also have no way to treat this sister. She is not suffering from a strange disease, but a very terrible evil poison. Generally, people who suffer from this kind of evil poison will even attack the people closest to them. I don't know why she did not attack you. I know that her disease is contagious. That's why I told you not to get too close to her," Dean said in a sad tone. The girl slightly raised her head. "I knew that there was something wrong with her physical condition. I wouldn't let her bite me." Dean lowered his head and didn't speak again. The atmosphere was a bit sad. The girl came to her senses and coughed awkwardly. She stepped forward and said, "I'll take off your divine ring." Dean looked at her. "Are you willing to believe me?" The girl's cheeks reddened as she looked at Dean's bright and pure eyes. "I will listen to the great priest." He stepped forward and took off the spirit ring for Dudian. He looked at the screen and his expression relaxed a lot. He turned back and returned to the front of the curtain. Seeing her like this, Dean was more and more convinced that the ring was an alternative lie detector. After receiving the divine ring, the old woman looked at it for a while before putting it away. Her attitude became much gentler and she said, "Outsider youth, thank you for saving our clansmen. Please forgive us if we offended you before." Her voice was extremely sweet and didn't sound like a white-haired old woman at all. Dean was even more convinced that the spirit ring was a device to test the truth of his words. Looking at the situation, it seemed that he had passed the test. "I heard that you have met outsiders before and were attacked by them. So it is inevitable that you will be hostile to me. I can understand," Dean said generously. The girl smiled and said slyly, "Really? Weren't you very nervous just now?" Dean's mouth slightly twitched. He was somewhat speechless. 130 years ago, we met outsiders like you." The old woman slowly opened her mouth. Her sweet voice was refreshing. "At that time, we met outsiders for the first time. We were very happy. We accepted him and treated him well. Unexpectedly, the outsider had ulterior motives. He was ready to enslave us and make us his servants. Fortunately, the great priest was powerful enough to kill him. But the great priest was seriously injured. This matter left a deep lesson for us. That's why we offended you." Dean nodded slightly. He could almost guess that it was a routine. However, the words from the old woman's mouth might not be true. Those who could come here were basically abyssal walkers, or even stronger. If these people were in the giant wall, then they would be wall lords. If they were in the kingdom of God, then most of them would be high-level personnel. They would certainly know a lot of secrets. Maybe they came prepared. As for the purpose of attacking them, it might not be to enslave them. After all, there weren't many people here. There were tens of millions of people in the giant wall. How could they lack slaves? Dean felt that the outsider was aiming at the corpses of the war god's family. Chapter 8:30. I'll leave after the night passes. I don't want to disturb you, Dudian said to both of them. The great priest whispered, "Mr. Dean, if you don't mind, I would like to invite you to stay with us for a few days. I believe that there are good and bad people in any place. You saved Prele, so we believe in your kindness. As you can see, there are desolate beasts rampaging everywhere outside and corpses roam the land. If not for that outsider from more than 100 years ago, we would not even know that there are other human survivors outside this world. If that outsider had not bared his fangs back then, the goddess of that generation would have married him and become husband and wife. We would have been united with you outsiders because of this. However, we never expected such a thing to happen. Marriage." Dudian looked at the girl in front of the curtain. The girl's cheeks reddened as she stared at Dudian. Why are you looking at me? Dudyan looked away. If you don't mind, then I'm happy to stay with you for a few days. If there is anything I can help you with, then don't hesitate to tell me. Thank you, Mr. Dean. Amelie, tell the wilderness generals to arrange a residence for Mr. Dean. He is our distinguished guest. The great priest whispered. The girl slightly pouted as she nodded. Amelie ordered the 2 wilderness generals to take Dudyan to rest after sending him out of the metal cabin. After that, the girl returned to the metal cabin. She lightly knocked on the wall, and the cabin door slowly closed. In an instant it became extremely quiet, and not a single sound could be heard from outside. Amelie turned to the Grand Priestess behind the veil. Sister, why did you let him stay? The divine ring clearly shows that he lied. He must have an ulterior motive for coming here. The curtains were lifted, and the old woman looked at her gently. She said softly, although he lied from the divine ring, he only lied about saving Prelay. He came here without knowing anything, which means he didn't come here on purpose. As for why he deliberately saved Prelay to get close to us, I think it should be because he thought he could find a way to save his lover from us, as he said before. Sister, do you really believe that the corpse is his lover? Amelie pouted. The old woman smiled. Haven't you noticed? That person's expression has always been incomparably cold and emotionless. Only when he looks at the corpse next to him will his eyes reveal a special warmth. That kind of warmth is rare even among extremely loving couples. Furthermore, the results from the divine ring show that he isn't lying about this, so I believe that he's telling the truth. But even so, he's still an outsider. If we let him stay, wouldn't it be very dangerous if he harbors evil intentions? She said. Prelay also said that this person could easily kill those 2 corpses. You've seen the heads of those 2 corpses. They were both wild general-level corpses, but he was able to kill them so easily. If such a dangerous person were to act against our people, it would cause unimaginable casualties. If we want to deal with him, we will have to pay an enormous price. It would be best if we let him leave and nothing will happen. The old woman sighed and said, How could I be willing to take such a risk? It's just that the Wilderness Divine Hall doesn't have much energy left. It can only supply us for about 10 years. After 10 years, this place will be in darkness and we will no longer be able to rely on the Wilderness Divine Hall to defend against the abyss desolate beasts outside. The only way is to find a new shelter as soon as possible. This person came at the right time. I have recently studied the information left behind by the outsider. The area we live in is called the Abyss region by the outsiders. Very few people can enter because the desolate beasts here are too strong. But outside the area they live in, the desolate beasts are very weak. Furthermore, they live in the Divine Wall. With the protection of the Divine Wall, they never have to worry about being attacked by desolate beasts. They can plant rice inside, making it a permanent shelter. We have to find a Divine Wall before the Wilderness Divine Hall's energy runs out. If not, the future 10 years from now will be unimaginable. Amelie was startled. Her small face had a hint of melancholy. She said, Elder sister, the last time you said to develop a new substitute for energy, is that not possible? If we leave this place and move to the Godly Wall, wouldn't it be too risky? The outsider from more than 100 years ago and this person are so powerful. How many people are as powerful as them in the Godly Wall? If we migrate over and a war breaks out, who knows how many people will die? The old woman was slightly silent. After a while, she said, The weak are prey to the strong. This is the law of this world. With the help of the Wilderness Divine Hall's power, we might have a chance to fight. But if we continue waiting like this, we will only become weaker and weaker until we completely perish. Amelie looked at her. Her eyes were slightly red and somewhat moist. Her small mouth was tightly pursed. The old woman glanced at her and gently rubbed her head. She said, Don't worry, we still have 10 years. We can first obtain the coordinates of the divine wall from this person and then send people to investigate the situation there. If it is suitable, we will migrate over. If it is not possible, we can migrate to other places. Living here is too difficult. Sister, do you want me to try him again? Amelie asked in a serious tone. The old woman looked at her and nodded. Dean left the small square. He pricked up his ears and listened to the cabin where the great priest lived. But he couldn't hear anything. The cabin door closed and the inside was completely isolated. He glanced at the huge statue on the square. He thought that there should be a corpse of the god of war here. Each corpse of the god was equivalent to the core of the giant wall. It was no less than the status of the imperial seal of a country in the old era. On the contrary, with the corpse of the god, he could build a new giant wall. Although the strength of the giant wall couldn't be compared with the giant walls of mysterious origin, but it should be able to resist the general monsters. However, he didn't have much interest in the corpse of the god. Instead, he was interested in the whole place, especially the place where the great priest lived. There should be a lot of weapons hidden there. If he got his hands on them, he could use them to kill Aristotle. If the halo is a lie detector, then they shouldn't be able to see that I have already guessed the effect of the halo. They should believe the results of the halo. Dean thought about how to build a good relationship with them. He wanted to get more useful information. For example, why didn't the god of war family live in the giant wall but in the abyss? Chapter 831. Look, it's the outsiders. Mom, do they come from the outside world? That sister is so beautiful. Stay away from them. Be careful of being attacked. A wilderness general brought Dean to the village. Along the way, many residents heard the news and came to watch. They stood in the distance and whispered. They were curious, excited, and afraid. Some of the older people frowned. Their faces showed disgust and hostility. Please. General Huang led the way for Dean. The other residents followed them all the way to a relatively spacious rough rock house. General Huang said to Dean, "You can live here for the time being. I'll send some living utensils to you. If there's anything you need, just tell me." Dean glanced at the house and nodded. "Thank you. Sorry to trouble you." "You're welcome. I'll go back if there's nothing else." General Huang said goodbye to Dean. Dean took Aisha into the house after General Huang left. The inside was almost as rough as the outside. There was a mat woven with weeds. Next to it was a stone platform. It seemed to be a table. There was nothing else. Dean felt regret as he saw the shabby appearance. 300 years had passed. Even if there was a fault in the civilization, at least they could rely on creation to restore a simple civilized society. After all, the greatest talent of human beings was creation. But this place only maintained the environment of primitive barbarians. He was disappointed. He took out a towel from his backpack and put it on the mat. He let Aisha sit on it to rest. He sat on the straw mat and quietly listened to the whispers of the residents who gathered outside. After listening for a moment, he found that the older people were hostile and wary of him. The young people and children were at a loss. They were just curious. It seems that after more than 100 years, they have forgotten about it. Only the older people know about it. It's convenient, Dean thought. The residents gathered outside the house for a few hours before gradually dispersing. Dean stayed in the room and did nothing. He was lying on the mat and quietly listening to the movements around him. He felt that the great priest would definitely send people to monitor him, and even use some technological items to monitor him. After all, the technology contained in the place where she lived was not inferior to the technology of the old era. Judging from the environment here, it was obvious that the thing was not made by them. They were just the users. Little dumb mouse, little dumb mouse. Suddenly, a tender voice interrupted Dean's thoughts. Dean could not help but sit up from the mat, looking at a small head peeking at the door. It was a girl about 7 or 8 years old. Her face was red and cute. The little girl saw Dean and slowly came out of the door. She asked, "Big brother, have you seen Silly Mouse?" Dean raised his eyebrows. "I haven't seen him." The little girl replied with an "Oh." She turned around and left dejectedly. Dean's heart moved. "I can help you find out. What does your Silly Mouse look like?" "Really?" The little girl turned her head and said, "It's like this. It's very small. It's very timid. It's hairy and gray. Its head is very small." Her description was a bit confusing, but Dean still understood that it was a small pet the size of a cat. His eyes flashed. He turned his head and glanced around. Soon he found something similar in size and shape. He smiled and got up. "I know where it is. I'll take you to it." "Really, big brother?" The little girl was very surprised. Dean stepped forward and took her to the corner of another rock house behind the house. In the corner, he reached out and grabbed a small gray fluffy thing. It looked like a mouse, but fatter than a mouse. Its ears were longer, like a rabbit. It looked cute and cute. "Ah, it's a Silly Mouse." The little girl happily reached out and hugged it. Dean smiled and touched her little head. "Little Jasmine, little Jasmine." Suddenly, an anxious voice came from the side. Dean turned his head and saw a middle-aged man running out in a hurry. The middle-aged man turned the corner and saw Dean. His eyes suddenly widened and he angrily said, You let go of me." Dean slightly frowned and put down his hand from the little girl's head. The little girl saw the middle-aged man and happily ran over. "Dad! Little Jasmine, are you okay?" The middle-aged man squatted down to check the little girl's hair and body. He was relieved to see that there was no wound. He turned his head and stared at Dean. "Outsider, I'm warning you. Don't get close to our child." The faint smile in Dean's eyes gradually disappeared. He quietly stood up and looked at the middle-aged man. The little girl pulled the middle-aged man's clothes and looked up. "Dad, is he the outsider?" "He is not as fierce as you said. He helped me find the Silly Mouse." The middle-aged man was startled. He looked at the cute little animal in her arms and seemed to understand. He looked at Dean and frowned. He didn't say anything. He picked up the little girl and turned away in a hurry. He soon disappeared from Dean's sight. Dean narrowed his eyes as he slowly walked back to his house. It didn't take long for an acquaintance to appear at the door of the house. It was Prelay and his companion who had been saved by Dean. They were holding 2 stone plates in their hands. They were covered with a lid. There were a few grilled fish inside. Dean smelled the faint aroma of the fish. He sat up and said to the two, "Why are you here?" "Mr. Dean, I inquired about the place where you live. I know that you haven't eaten lunch yet. I specially brought you a few small fish. I don't know if it suits your appetite." Prelay smiled. He put the stone plate on the table and opened the lid. There were a few grilled bluefish. There were a few light blue scales on the surface. Duty thought that they had come at the right time. He said, "Since you are here, let's eat together. I also have a few questions to ask you." No, we have already eaten at home. The amount here is not much. If we eat again then it won't be enough for you and Miss Aisha." Prelay waved his hand and said. There was a trace of embarrassment on his face. Dean saw him and looked at the few small blue fishes. He understood that it was very dangerous for them to venture out to hunt these small fishes. It showed how important food was to them. Looking at Prilay's age, it was obvious that he was already married. He wasn't the only one who had the final say in the family. Fear of his wife seemed to be a thing that had never disappeared in the past 5,000 years. Dean didn't try to persuade them again. He also didn't reach out to catch fish. Instead, he said, "It's so dangerous outside. You are taking such a big risk to catch such a small amount of fish. What if you lose your life? Isn't it not worth it?" Hearing him mention this, Prelay immediately thought of his life-saving grace, and his face became even more embarrassed. He said in shame, "Speaking of which, it's all thanks to you that we could survive this time. We don't go fishing often, and usually only go once in a while, and we always go at the time that the great priest has calculated. Usually, when we go hunting at the time that the great priest has calculated, we rarely encounter any danger. This time, we were really unlucky, but fortunately we met you, otherwise we really wouldn't have been able to return. The great priest can calculate the danger of hunting? Dean was surprised. Priley's eyes showed a pious color. The great priest has inherited the will of the origami. She can predict the good and bad luck. She knows all kinds of things in the outside world. Dean was surprised. Didn't it mean that the great priest had a way to observe the situation around the outside world? Did she have a super detector or some kind of technological item? Dean's eyes lit up. He didn't ask about this matter again but turned to another question. I see that the wilderness generals here are very powerful. Why don't you let them go out to hunt? Wouldn't it be more reliable and the harvest would be more? Desolate is going to guard this place. If we run into some vicious desolate beasts that discover this place and sneak in, they'll be able to find out in time and kill them. Things like hunting are all left to us desolate hunting squads, Prelay said with a laugh. Wilderness hunting team? That's right, people like us who specialize in hunting in the wild. There was a trace of pride in Priley's eyes. Mr. Dean, I'm a captain of the wilderness hunting team. It's a captain. His companion reminded him. Prelay stared at him. A captain is also a captain. Dean saw the two joking and asked, Are there a lot of people like you who go out to hunt? How can I join you? Chapter 832. Earth Dragon Cave? Wild Worm? The former was obviously a place name, so there was no need to ask. But the latter made Dean curious. He thought of parasitic soulworm, but parasitic soulworms were hidden in monsters. He asked, What is this wild worm? Is it difficult to catch? With benefactor's skills, it would be easy to catch them. However, to a person who has never eaten a desolate worm, these little things are very dangerous. Although it is easy to catch them, these little things have all sorts of strange abilities. Some have a strong acid that can corrode protective glove. Furthermore, these little things have a common ability, which is to suck blood and parasitize. If they accidentally touch the body, they will drill into the body. This is very dangerous, and it is very easy to die. Therefore, daring to go to the Earth Dragon Cave to catch a desolate worm is proof of your courage, Prelay said with some pride. If you don't even dare to go to the Earth Dragon Cave, then don't talk about going outside and facing those horrible wild beasts. Dean was surprised. Priley's words had exposed a lot of information. Can you eat wasteland worms? You didn't eat the wild worms you caught, right? What kind of changes can there be in people who eat wild worms? Priley's eyes showed appreciation. Benefactor is really smart. Wild worms are a great tonic. After eating wild worms, your strength and physical strength will be greatly improved. As long as you eat enough, you can even become a wild general. But wild generals are people who have experienced hundreds of battles in the Earth Dragon Cave. Even people like us who have eaten wild worms to improve our strength are generally not willing to enter the Earth Dragon Cave again. These little things are too dangerous. Even if a wild general goes in, there is a possibility of death. Dean was slightly startled, but there was a huge wave in his heart. Eating wild worms can improve strength? Priley's physique was around the level of senior hunter. Did he eat wild worms to improve it? You said eating wild worms. Is it like this? Dean made an action of throwing something into his mouth. Prelay said strangely, Yes, otherwise how can I eat it? Dean was slightly dumbfounded. His heart suddenly had a strong interest in the wild worm. In his understanding of the giant wall of Sylvia, to enhance the physique, he must rely on the parasitic soul worm to inhabit the body. With the help of the parasitic soul worm, he could enhance his strength. Such an evolutionary system had been maintained since the end of the era of experimental witchers. No one had thought that there would be other evolutionary routes, especially Dean. His worldview was the old era of scientific and technological materialism, and he knew the limits of human physical strength. Even the world's strongest fighter, a muscle madman who trained every day since childhood, could only barely reach the level of a junior hunter, unlike a senior hunter like Prelay. Not to mention, these kinds of people often had the appearance of a monster with bulging muscles all over their body. With the help of magic marks to enhance his strength, the unknown magic marks made him reluctantly accept such a reality. But among the residents of the abyss, they could enhance their physique just by eating. Even if he ate the best delicacies in the world and the most nutritious comprehensive food, it might not have such an effect, right? How much can the human body absorb? The digestive capacity of the stomach is limited, and the excessive nutrition won't enhance the physique. Instead, it will only lead to hyperglycemia, Dean thought in his heart. But from Priley's words, it didn't seem like a lie. Was the wild worm really so magical? If you want to become stronger, you can only go to the Earth Dragon Cave to find wild worms to eat? Dean asked Prelay. Prelay nodded. I've been there 3 times, so I'm the captain. My strength is much stronger than this guy. He's timid, so he's only been there once. But the Baron Generals are different. They've been there at least 10 times. Dean felt that another path of evolution had appeared in front of him. However, he didn't know whether this path or the magic marks evolution system inside the giant wall was more perfect, or which one was harmless, or the end point of both was destruction. Why not let the Baron Generals catch more wild worms from the Earth Dragon Cave? Wouldn't it make a lot of people stronger? Dean asked this question. Prelay was stunned. The number of wild worms is limited. Every once in a while, the Earth Dragon Cave will open. Some people want to catch more wild worms, but it's good enough to catch one. Moreover, these wild worms have a sense of each other. If you catch one, then the difficulty of catching other wild worms will increase exponentially. Other wild worms will sense your existence through their companions, and then stay away. They will even gather together to besiege you. There was once a greedy person who caught 3 wild worms, but he wasn't satisfied. As a result, he was surrounded by a group of wild worms. In the end, he only found his bones and clothes. Dean asked, "Can I go to the Earth Dragon Cave? The Great Priest invited me to stay here for a few days. I can join your hunting team and help you hunt." Of course. Prelay was happy. With your skill, even if you don't go to the Earth Dragon Cave, you are more than enough to join our hunting team. The Earth Dragon Cave will open in more than a month. If Benefactor wants to go to the Earth Dragon Cave, then you can apply to the Great Priest. After all, Benefactor is an outsider. I don't know if the Great Priest will agree or not. More than a month? Dean's eyes lit up. I'll give it a try. Speaking of which, do I need to apply to the Great Priest to join the hunting team? You don't need to. Prelay laughed. If Benefactor wants to join, then you can do it now. I'm the captain. I can let Benefactor directly become a member of our team. But it's a bit of an injustice to Benefactor. It's a small matter. The companion reminded him again. Prelay glanced at him. Dean smiled. It's not an injustice. My identity is sensitive. I'll stay here for a while and then leave. It's good that I can help you a little. The position doesn't mean anything to me. Benefactor doesn't plan to stay for a long time? Prelay asked. Dean shook his head. I'll see. Prelay understood and didn't ask any more questions. Remembering that he hadn't eaten the fish on the plate yet, he hurriedly said, Benefactor, please eat the fish first. We've been chatting and it's getting cold. Please enjoy your meal, Benefactor. We'll be heading back first. If there's anything you need, you can find me at number 21. Dean nodded. The houses were engraved with numbers. It wasn't difficult to follow the numbers. Dean looked at the blue fish after they left. He missed the days when Noyce was by his side. However, from the reaction of Prelay and the great priest, it seemed that they wouldn't poison the fish. Chapter 833. 5 days passed in the blink of an eye. Dudyan spent most of the time in his own house during these 5 days. The people in the village seemed to have gradually become accustomed to his existence. Many villagers were warned by the elders, but their curiosity still drove them to come closer to peek at Dudyan. As a result, they found that Dudyan seemed to be completely different from the fierce and brutal image described by the elders, so their courage slowly grew. Some children often came to play outside Dudyan's residence. At first, they were called back by their parents, but later nothing happened, so the children were allowed to play here. For the past 5 days, Preet would send food to Dudyan every day. At first, it was blue fish, but later the number of fish sent gradually decreased. In the end, only some strange leaves and fruits were sent. Dudyan knew that most of the people here ate these fruits as food. The soil here was seriously radioactive, so it was impossible to plant them. These edible fruits were plants that they had tried for hundreds of years. They were transplanted into the village, but there were not many of them. Therefore, even the light fruits were very precious. Most people could only eat some boiled watergrass and bark. Dudyan occasionally wandered around the village. Everywhere he went, he would attract the surrounding residents' hostile gazes, but he didn't care. After 5 days of contact, he found that the population in the village was not large. A total of 400 or 500 people were spread out around the temple where the great priest lived. Most of the villagers couldn't have children because of radiation, especially the members of the hunting team who often went out to explore. Therefore, women and children were extremely precious here. In this highly scarce situation, there was an unimaginable marriage between a maid and many husbands. In this kind of absurd marriage, there was still the existence of love. For example, Preet, who often came to deliver food to Dudyan, shared his wife with 2 other men. In this case, he still loved his wife deeply. He also thought that his wife also loved him deeply. Both of them were in love with each other. Moreover, he was not jealous of the existence of the other 2 people. Instead, he was good friends with the other 2 people. Dean felt that his worldview was completely destroyed when he knew about this. However, he thought about the dangerous environment and ferocious monsters that he had encountered along the way. It was extremely difficult and unimaginable to survive in such an environment for more than 300 years. In such an absurd environment, this absurd marriage and love was born. Dean had a special feeling every time he saw Pooh Linley happily talk about his wife. Adaptation was a terrible thing. When you get used to it, you can no longer judge right from wrong. But in the final analysis, the standard of right and wrong was only based on the worldview that you have long been accustomed to. As a cliché saying goes, no one can see their own mistake. No one knows that they are a clown. In addition to this strange marriage system, Dudyan found that the residents here seemed to have some leisure and hate work. In addition to the hunting team, other old people and women stayed at home all day long, in a daze, playing simple games to pass the time. It seemed that no one thought about improving the environment and no one thought about creating anything. After asking a few people, Dean knew that they were counting on the Grand Priest. In their minds, the Grand Priest was an omnipotent existence. He was the apostle appointed by the desolate God, and he had the power of a god. Because of this, many people had lost their desire to struggle. After all, they only needed to ask the Grand Priest to answer their questions. Why would they waste their time thinking about it? It made Dean think that a good leader may not be able to bring out a group of outstanding talent. However, there were also environmental factors. In this sealed underground world, their range of activity was very limited. Over time, people became lazy. Dean was familiar with the atmosphere of this place. His physical strength had reached the bottleneck of the peak of the Dominator level. Even if he injected more God serum, he wouldn't be able to reach the level of the abyss. However, there was no limit to the improvement of combat skills. Dean was able to get the secret combat skills of the Dragon Clan, the Wing Clan and the Rock Clan because of his rights as a Wall Lord. The Dragon Blood skill of the Dragon Clan, the Diamond Body of the Rock Clan and the Lightning Wings of the Wing Clan were all very practical combat skills. Benefactor. Pooh Riley carried the stone box and trotted to the outside of Dean's house. He excitedly rushed in and saw Dean crawling on the ground in a strange posture. He laughed. Benefactor, are you exercising? Dean stood up from the ground. He didn't blame Pooh Lillet for not knocking the door. Why are you so happy? Pooh Lillet grinned. The Grand Priest said that we can go to the Blue Fish Lake at dawn tomorrow. There won't be any danger. Is that so? That's good. We can catch more this time. Dean faintly smiled. He had asked Pooh Lillet to take him out to hunt in the past few days. He wanted to rely on the harvest to quickly establish a friendly relationship with the village. However, Pooh Lillet refused because it was too dangerous. Now he could finally go out and get some fresh air. Yes, Pooh Lillet excitedly said. This time we can definitely catch a lot. I'll go back and prepare a bag. Benefactor, I'll come to you in the evening. Let's meet at the tunnel. Meet? Dean asked. Are there others? Yes, I heard that Benefactor's strength is extraordinary. Many people want to join us and go to the Blue Fish Lake with us. Pooh Lillet laughed. I saw that the situation of their families was not very good, so I agreed. Anyway, the Grand Priest said that there will be no danger as long as there are no more than 20 people. So in addition to us there are 18 people. Oh okay. Dean nodded, but there was some helplessness in his heart. The Grand Priest said that there would be no more than 20 people, but there were exactly 20 people. Then it's settled. I'll go back and prepare now, Pooh Lillet said excitedly. Dean nodded. After Pooh Lillet left, he opened the stone box. There were 2 small blue fish inside. He hadn't eaten this fish for 2 days. He thought that tomorrow's departure would be a big harvest, so he took out all the fish he had. I don't know how it tastes when I catch the thing at the bottom of the lake. Dean thought of the horrible monster fish in the depths of the lake, and his eyes flashed slightly. Since he intended to perform well and establish a friendly relationship with these villagers, this time he naturally couldn't be ordinary. However, if he caught it with his own strength, it would inevitably cause some people to be wary. Even among these people, it was likely that there were spies arranged by the Grand Priest who deliberately used this matter to test his strength. I used the dragon blood technique to suppress the reaction of the heat source. They should not know my specific strength. They can only speculate from the 2 undead. At most, they think that I'm at the pioneer level or even the inner wilderness. It seems that it is necessary to hide my strength. Dean's mind turned. If he wanted to fish while hiding his strength, then he could only use tools. Chapter 834. The night came. Prelay came to Dean's door with a spear. He invited Dean to go to the tunnel. So early? Dean was surprised. From the pocket watch he was wearing, it was less than 6 o'clock at night. There were still more than 10 hours before dawn. Wild beasts will come out to hunt at night. It's not suitable to walk in the tunnel. So we have to go to the tunnel in advance and rest there for the night. Prelay explained. Dean thought for a moment. I have an idea that can double our harvest. But we need to prepare some tools. I don't know if you have them here? Prelay's eyes lit up. Double the harvest of fishing? Benefactor, what tools do you need? A strong rope. I want to weave a fishing net. The interest in Prelay's eyes instantly disappeared. He smiled bitterly and said, Benefactor, do you want to use fishing nets to catch them? It's useless. We have already tried this method. The fish in Blue Fish Lake are carnivores. Their teeth are sharp and can easily bite through the fishing net. Dean shook his head. Weaving a fishing net is not for catching fish but for trapping fish. You will know when the time comes. Do you have a ready-made fishing net here? Trapping fish? Prelay was puzzled and said, The nets are ready-made, but they are not used to catch fish. They are used to trap small wild beasts and are kept by other hunting teams. If Benefactor wants them, I can borrow them. However, if they are damaged, we will have to compensate them. Dean heard that Prelay was worried about the safety of the fishing net. He didn't say much. Go borrow it. I will compensate if it is damaged. Seeing his confident look, Prelay asked doubtfully, Benefactor, is the method you mentioned really effective? It should be. Dean didn't say anything. Yes, there are still 18 people. Let them wear digging tools if they don't have a spear. Don't bring spears? Prelay was stunned. Going out to hunt without weapons but digging tools? Was he trying to dig a hole to bury himself? Dean saw his strange expression and could guess his thoughts. He said, Believe me, it's useless to bring a spear. All of you should bring digging tools. Also, borrow a large fishing net. Benefactor, this. Prelay was a bit hesitant. After all, it wasn't easy to go out hunting, and this was a rare opportunity. It would have been fine if he had gone alone, but the problem was that there were 18 other people with him. Behind these 18 people were over 10 families, and they had to carry the rations of the children and elderly of those families. If they went out and didn't gain anything, then the days ahead would be very difficult. Benefactor, it's not that I don't trust you. I'm just worried that others might not be willing to do this, Prelay said tactfully. Dean saw his dilemma. If someone wants to bring a spear, then let them bring it. If others bring digging tools, then let them bring fish bags. If there is no accident, then there should be a bumper harvest. All right. Prelay smiled bitterly. If Dean hadn't saved him, he wouldn't have bothered to listen to his nonsense. Going out to hunt without a spear, how could he expect a big harvest? It would be good if he didn't come back naked. An hour later Prelay came to Dean with the borrowed fishing net. There were 3 or 4 strong men with him. All of them were carrying shovels, hoes and other digging tools. Prelay saw Dean waiting at the door and quickly came over. Benefactor, I've borrowed the fishing net. But be careful when using it. They said that if it's damaged you have to compensate them at least 30 fish. Dean glanced at the fishing net. It was woven with bark fibers and vines. The net was very thick, but it could be used to hunt monsters outside, so it was considered delicate. He pinched the fishing net. He was satisfied. He asked, Where are the others? They are waiting for us outside the tunnel. Prelay looked at the faint lights on top of the village. It's getting late. Benefactor, should we go now? All right. Dean nodded and went back to the house. He took Aisha out. Let's go. Miss Aisha is going too? Prelay was surprised. Dean indifferently smiled. I won't separate from her. Prelay didn't ask any more questions. He called the people behind him to carry the fishing net and set off. It didn't take long for them to come to the tunnel outside the village. They saw more than a dozen people standing in front of the tunnel. Most of them were carrying spears in their hands. They were carrying a small basket on their back. They were waiting in boredom. More than a dozen people looked over as they saw Dean and Prelay. Their eyes fell on Dean. They were full of curiosity. A few of them had vigilance and indifference in their eyes. Dean didn't care as he walked over. Everyone, this is Mr. Dean. My benefactor. Prelay introduced Dean to everyone. Everyone looked at Dean but didn't speak. The atmosphere was a bit awkward. Prelay knew that Dean's identity was sensitive. He lightly coughed. Everyone, it's getting late. Let's go to the tunnel. Old Ray, are you really going to bring only shovels and no spears? One of the middle-aged men frowned. Prelay looked at him and then at Dean. We don't need a spear. If you want to bring it, then bring it yourself. Old Ray, if we don't get anything, then you will have to eat grass for a few days. The middle-aged man reminded. Prelay shook his head and waved. Get ready to go. The middle-aged man looked at Dean. There was a trace of dissatisfaction in his eyes, but he didn't say anything. This time Prelay was leading the team. He just needed to ensure that he wouldn't return empty-handed. Everyone entered the tunnel one after another. Not long after, they arrived at the entrance of the tunnel that was blocked by rocks. They saw two desolate generals standing guard here, and at the entrance, other than them, there were actually two groups of people. Each group had about a dozen people, and at this moment they were sitting in two piles, sleeping on the ground. Dean glanced at the two groups of people. They were carrying a lot of tools. There were hunting nets, huge wooden frames, spears, swords and other weapons. With great familiarity, Prelay came to another empty space and called for everyone to rest. Dean asked him about the two groups. Prelay explained in a low voice. They are the 3rd and 5th hunting teams. They are mainly hunting small wild beasts in the southern part of the wasteland. It has nothing to do with us. Dudian was curious, so he asked a few more questions. He learned that the hunting areas of the hunting teams were different. For example, Prelay was mainly responsible for the Blue Fish Lake. The reason for such a division was that the Blue Fish Lake was first found by Prilay's grandfather. So the great priest divided the Blue Fish Lake to him. Now it fell on Prilay's head. Others who wanted to go to the Blue Fish Lake had to join Prilay's hunting team. Prelay would get 1/10 of the prey they hunted. Dean was surprised by such a regulation. It was quite a perfect contract. He didn't expect that it would be implemented in such a backward and poor place. But it did improve efficiency. "Hey, old Ray, are you going to hunt tomorrow?" A middle-aged man about the same age as Prelay walked out from one of the group. He seemed to be very familiar with Prelay. He smiled and said, "You've brought so many people this time. Are you preparing for something big?" Prelay laughed. "Of course not. How are your preparations this time?" "What preparation? No matter how good the preparation is, we have to rely on the heavens to eat." The man smiled and glanced at the crowd. His eyes stayed on Dean for a moment. "I heard that you brought the outsider to hunt together. Isn't he very strong?" Prelay said grumpily, "Definitely several times stronger than you. Haha, he can easily kill the dead. He is indeed stronger than me." The man laughed. Dean glanced at the two. He leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. He was waiting for tomorrow's hunting operation. Time passed quickly, and when it was 8 or 9 o'clock, everyone fell asleep one after another. Light snores rose and fell in the tunnel. In the darkness they didn't know how much time had passed until a rough voice called out, "Wake up, it's time." Dean woke up from his light sleep. He opened his eyes and saw that the others were also waking up. The one who spoke was the wilderness. The rock at the entrance of the tunnel had been pushed open. Prelay also woke up. He patted the people who were still sleeping and pulled everyone up. "Get ready, we are going." Everyone quickly packed up their things and followed Prelay out of the cave. In the blink of an eye, 3 groups of people went to their respective hunting site. The sky was bright. Glimmers of light shone from the clouds. Dean smelled the unique humidity and freshness of the early morning in the wilderness. He felt that all the pores on his body were slightly stretched out. His consciousness was extraordinarily clear. He held Aisha's hand and followed Prelay. They crossed the woods and walked for a while until they came to the Blue Lake. The lake was as calm as a mirror. It was a beautiful blue lake. Everyone's eyes lit up as they saw the blue lake. They couldn't wait to go forward and fight. Dean sniffed the air. He smelled the residual smell of blood in the air. He saw a few messy monster paw prints in the distance. It seemed that other monsters had come here in the past few days. It seemed that they had experienced a fierce battle. It seems that this water source is a good place to attract monsters. Dean thought in his heart. At this time, Prelay came to Dean's side and asked, "Benefactor, we have limited time. We only have 2 hours. What are you going to do?" Dean knew that time was pressing. He didn't want to be long-winded. "Go to the shallow water where you caught fish last time. Listen to my command and dig a deep pit. We will lead the fish to the pit we dug. Finally, we will concentrate on fishing." Prelay was at a loss. After all, he didn't even bring a weapon. He could only listen to Dean's command. He turned and gathered everyone. They came to the shallow water where they had caught fish last time. He looked at Dean. "Where do we dig a pit?" Dean pointed to the shallow lake and said, "Make an opening here and dig a pit here. Everyone start digging immediately. Dig the pit 2 meters deep and extend it to here. About 10 meters. Prelay looked at Dean's gesture. Although he had never thought of this method, but from Dean's gesture, the feasibility was extremely high. He immediately called everyone. "Everyone get ready. Follow Mr. Dean's instructions." Then he took the shovel to the lake and quickly dug the soil. The others looked at each other and followed him to dig the soil. The other 7 or 8 people with spears saw the actions of Prelay and others. They looked at each other and were at a loss. They didn't know whether they should help or wait. Soon, the middle-aged man who had previously reminded Prelay took the lead and left. He came to another foothold near the shallow lake. He took the spear and stabbed the fish into the water. Soon he got one and put it in the basket. The others saw that he had a harvest and immediately surrounded him. They found a foothold in the shallow water and used spears to stab the fish. There were as many small blue fish in the lake as there were hairs on a cow. When they saw someone approaching, they all gathered around the lake. Some of the small fish jumped up and bit the tip of the spear, their small mouths full of sharp teeth. Dean looked at them but didn't say anything. His eyes swept to the center of the lake from time to time. He was wary of the terrifying fish lurking to attack them. At the same time he came to the side of the woods. He used a sword to cut the trees and cut them into small wooden sticks. He used them to prop up the fishing net into a long basket. After a moment, the deep pit that Dean had pointed out was dug. Everyone had a hunter's physique, so the efficiency of digging the pit was very fast. "Benefactor, what about now?" Prelay wiped the sweat from his forehead as he glanced at the people on the other side of the lake. There was a trace of heat and tension in his eyes as he asked Dudian, "Put the fishing net here." Dean gestured for him to put the fishing net horizontally into the deep pit. Several people worked together and soon the fishing net was fixed in the pit. Dean took the shovel from Priley's hand and quickly dug out the middle of the pit and the lake. The lake water slowly flowed into the deep pit. But the blue fish were attracted by the few people. Only a few small fish flowed into the deep pit along the lake water. Dean swung his sword and stabbed into the lake water. He picked up a small blue fish. His wrist slightly turned and the sword quickly cut the small fish into several pieces. Blood flowed out. He threw the pieces into the middle and the end of the pit. It didn't take long for the stimulation of the bloody smell to attract all the small fish in the lake. The lake was boiling and the small fish kept jumping. As the lake water flowed, the small fish quickly rushed into the deep pit. It happened that the mouth of the fishing net in the deep pit was aimed at the mouth of the lake. All the small fish rushed into the net and swam towards the depths of the net. In less than a few minutes, the fishing net in the 2 meters deep and 10 meters long pit was filled with blue fish and lake water. There were at least hundreds of thousands of small fish in the net. Prelay and several other people who were digging the pit saw the scene and stared at it in disbelief. Dean saw that the time was almost up. He said to Prelay, "Block the mouth of the lake." Prelay came back to his senses and hurriedly called for the people beside him to go forward with shovels. They shoveled the soil from the pit into the mouth of the lake and filled it up. The lake water stopped pouring in. The pit was full of fish and lake water. Dean asked Prelay to continue to dig at the end of the pit. Dig deeper and let the lake water flow out. Prelay understood as soon as Dudian said it. The others were also enlightened. They picked up the shovel and started to dig the soil. They felt that their blood was boiling. Soon, they worked together to dig a small pit. The water in the pit quickly flowed out and was absorbed by the soil. The fishing net in the pit quickly sank. There were only struggling blue fish in the net. Dean looked at the time. Only an hour had passed. He estimated that he could make another net. So many. Prelay looked at the blue fish struggling in the net due to the lack of oxygen. His eyes widened in excitement. The others also looked straight at it. They swallowed their saliva. They felt like they were in a dream. Dean said, "Get ready to pull the net out. We'll make another net and then we'll go back." Prelay was stunned when he heard Dudian say that he wanted to make another net. He subconsciously said, We don't have enough bags." Chapter 8:35. Old Ray, how is the harvest here? One of the people who had been catching fish by the lake noticed the excited expressions on the faces of Prelay and the others who were surrounding the deep pit. Feeling that it was strange, he walked over with his spear in hand. Prelay turned to look at him. His eyes fell on his basket. There were a few small fish gently bouncing. "Bien, the harvest is good." Bien grinned. Just as he was about to say something, his gaze was suddenly attracted by the scene in the deep pit in front of him. He opened his mouth slightly and stood rooted to the ground. After a while, he turned to look at Prelay with a face full of disbelief. This was all done by you just now? Did you do it last night?" Prelay laughed. The others also laughed. They were particularly excited. At first they were worried that they wouldn't be able to catch anything with shovels, but this novel way of hunting gave them unexpected surprises. The fish in the pit was enough for them to live for many days. Dudian wanted to catch another net. They felt unprecedented happiness and excitement. "Oh my God!" Bean's eyes widened as he exclaimed. The people who were fishing by the lake in the distance heard the commotion and walked over curiously. Soon, a series of exclamations rang out. All the people who were fishing opened their eyes wide and were tongue-tied. Dudian frowned as he saw the blue fish struggling in the net. He didn't expect the fish to be so fierce. They could persist for so long even if they were dehydrated. He looked at Prelay. "Tell everyone to open a hole in the back of the net and prepare to collect the fish. Put them in the mud and be careful not to be bitten." At the moment when Dudian spoke, everyone pricked up their ears to listen. Dudian didn't wait for Prelay to agree. Someone called out, "I'll do it! I'll do it too! Count me in!" Prelay laughed as he saw everyone's enthusiasm. He immediately assigned them to go behind the deep pit net. Due to the low terrain, the fish slipped out of the net and fell into the mud below as soon as the gap was opened. Several people stood in the mud and scooped up the fish with shovels. They threw them to the side of the shore. The others waited at the edge of the pit and immediately swatted or knocked out the fish that were thrown up. Then, they put the fish into bags and baskets. A few people at the side saw them collecting the fish wantonly and were extremely envious. They felt like a piece of delicious food was exuding a tempting fragrance in front of them. Some of them also bent down to pick up the fish with their baskets. Noticing that a few of the fish catchers were also picking up the fish, Prelay shouted, "You guys, didn't we agree earlier that you could catch your fish and we'd catch ours? Why are you picking up our fish?" As soon as he opened his mouth, the others who were working hard also noticed this and immediately shouted, "Yes! What are you doing? Why are you picking up our fish? We dug this hole and caught the fish. Isn't it inappropriate for you to pick them up?" The people picking up the fish felt embarrassed when they heard their protests and unkind gazes. One of them said, "There are so many fish. You can't fit them all. We all came out together. Why do you have to do this?" "What do you mean we can't fit it? Who said we can't fit it?" Someone immediately said angrily. Although the people present knew each other and could be regarded as acquaintances, but in the face of food they couldn't speak. The people who were picking up the fish knew that they were in the wrong, but it was hard for them to watch helplessly as they couldn't get a single one of the fish. The middle-aged man who had tried to persuade Prelay earlier said, "Old Lay, we're out hunting. You can't be so heartless. There are so many fish, and you're not giving us a single one. Isn't that too much?" Prelay's eyebrows twitched as he heard the words. "I told you to bring a shovel. Did you bring it? We were digging the soil and you were picking up the fish. If we didn't catch a single fish, would you share the fish with us?" The middle-aged man was rendered speechless by his words. Dean saw that they were about to quarrel, so he immediately came out and called out, "Old Lay." Everyone saw him speak and immediately looked at him. "Let them take the fish. We are all from the same village. There is no need to divide the fish," Dean said generously. "Prelay was a bit unwilling, but they didn't listen to you and talked about you behind your back. They didn't put any effort to catch the fish." Dean slightly raised his hand to stop him. "Life is not easy. Give me face and give them my share. I can't eat so much anyway." "How can that be?" Prelay shouted as he heard that Dean was going to give up his share. The people who were picking the fish didn't expect that Dean would speak for them. Moreover, he wanted to give up his share. They couldn't help but feel grateful but also ashamed and remorseful. "Old Lay." Dean looked at Prelay. Prelay saw that Dean was so determined. He sighed in his heart. "Since you have spoken, as long as no one has any opinion, then let them have their share." "I have no opinion." "I have no opinion either. These fish are Mr. Dean's idea. Mr. Dean can divide it to whoever he wants." "Would you agree if Mr. Dean said that he wouldn't divide it to you?" The others laughed as they heard the funny words. The atmosphere suddenly eased. "Hurry up and fill the fish," Dean said. Everyone knew that time was of the essence, so they clenched their teeth and worked hard. Those who were poaching the fish also helped out. Only when they were poaching the fish did they realize that the small baskets they brought were too small and could not hold much at all. Before they came, they thought that if they could fill one basket, it would be a great harvest. But now, it seemed that compared to Prelay and the others who brought large bags, it was nothing. Many of them regretted their previous short-sightedness. It didn't take long for the fish to be thrown out of the deep pit. Dean looked at the time and ordered Prelay to reset up the fishing net. Then he dug the edge of the lake. The water rushed in along with a large number of blue fish. Everyone was secretly excited as they collected the small fish on the shore and looked at the shoals of fish that kept pouring into the fishing net. The people who were picking the fish finally knew why they were able to catch so many fish. Compared to them picking the fish one by one, this fishing method was simply looting. Dean looked at the lake in front of him, paying attention to the appearance of the terrifying fish. However, when the net was filled with fish again, the terrifying fish still did not appear. His heart was relieved. This way, it would save him the trouble to do it himself. In the blink of an eye, the hunting time was coming to an end. Dean led everyone back. Everyone was carrying a full bag and fish basket. More than a dozen people were carrying the fish in the fishing net. The harvest was amazing. Back in the canyon, Prelay knocked on the rock and everyone returned to the tunnel. The two Baron generals were surprised to see the harvest. They couldn't help but look at Dean. They knew that such a terrifying harvest should be related to the outsider. After all, they had seen Prelay leading the team to catch fish countless times. But they had never seen such a huge harvest. Although the fish was very heavy, the atmosphere of the team was very happy. After entering the tunnel, one of them couldn't help but hum a song. The others heard the tune and sang together. In this way, they sang and sang back to the village. All the harvested fish were piled up in the square at the entrance of the village. Some children who were playing nearby were shocked when they saw it. The news quickly spread throughout the village and attracted a lot of people to watch. Dean saw the excited expressions of these people and smiled in his heart. This food didn't have much value for him, but it was the best tool to bring the relationship with the residents here closer. He felt that if he could catch a few more fish, he would soon become the existence of the people here. At that time, it would be very convenient for him to do anything. "Old Lay, count the number of fish," Dudian said. Prelay looked at the amazed and envious eyes of the surrounding residents. He felt a kind of pride and honor. After hearing Dean's command, he felt a sense of enjoyment. He immediately ordered a few people to pour out the fish and began to count. In the process of counting, two groups of people came from behind the tunnel. It was the two groups of people who went out with them to hunt. One of them was carrying a 3-meter-tall monster that looked like a wild boar, humming a tune as it walked over. "Hey, old lay!" The middle-aged man who greeted Prelay when he was sleeping in the tunnel pushed away the crowd. He saw Prelay but didn't say anything. His eyes were attracted by the pile of fish in the open space. He couldn't help but stare dumbfounded. Prelay heard the shout and turned to see him. "Jesse, you are back. Not bad. The harvest this time is so big." Jesse recovered and couldn't help but stare at him. "Are you sarcastic? Did you catch all the fish in the lake? So many?" Prelay laughed. "If we really fished them all out, then there wouldn't be enough here." Jesse rolled his eyes as he looked around the square. He saw Dean's figure. "Old Ray, is this outsider behind all of this?" Prelay snapped. "Don't call me an outsider. This is my benefactor, Mr. Dean." Jesse slightly curled his lips as he looked at the pile of fish on the ground. He was envious, but he knew that it was useless to look at it. He waved. "Let's go and divide the fish." It didn't take long for the number of fish to be counted. There was a total of more than 1,800 fish. Prelay gave 500 fish to Dean, but Dean refused. He proposed to hold a fish banquet in the evening and invite the whole village to taste it since it was a big harvest today. Prelay heard that the whole village was invited to taste the fish. His heart was reluctant, but since Dean had opened his mouth, he was embarrassed to refuse. Moreover, he had learned Dean's method. In the future, when he went out to fish, he would have a big harvest. Metal Temple. After Amelie reported to the great divine priest, she pouted and said, "This person is quite powerful. He didn't use any martial arts at all, but he caught so many fish. I wanted to take this opportunity to see what he is capable of, but I didn't see anything." "I saw a lot," the great priest slowly said. "He is very smart and has an intention towards our village." "Smart is right. Sister, are you saying that he has an intention towards us?" Amelia was surprised. The great priest said slowly, "He's just a passerby. There's no need for him to be so kind to us. Amelie, you must remember that there's always a motive behind any unnecessary kindness. I don't think that a person like him, who dared to survive in such a dangerous place, would have the kindness of a child. So, he must have taken a fancy to us." "What will he see in us, sister?" Amelie asked her obediently. Chapter 836. 20 days passed in the blink of an eye. Dean stayed in the village all day. In addition to exercising, he ate, drank, and rested. There was very little entertainment here. Most people's habit was to eat and sleep. After all, sleep was the most energy-conserving thing. Parents supported their children to do the most. But such a phenomenon was undoubtedly a slow death. Since the end of the fish feast, Dean had not left the village. Prelay and others had looked for the great priest several times, but the answer they got was that it was not suitable for hunting, which made them quite disappointed. After all, it was not easy for them to learn Dean's fast fishing method. But after more than 20 days, they didn't have the opportunity to go again. Such a long interval was rarely seen in the past. Fortunately, there were still a lot of fish left after the fish feast. It was enough to sustain them for 1 or 2 months. After all, they had other sundries to eat. Dean wasn't anxious and waited quietly. He could guess the great priest's thoughts. She was worried that his relationship with the villagers would be too close and threaten her existence. Soon, it would be the day when the Earth Dragon cave would open. Dean felt that it was time to meet the High Priest again. In the past 20 days, the High Priest hadn't taken the initiative to find him, and he also hadn't taken the initiative to find the High Priest. Although they hadn't met, but Dean could roughly guess her thoughts. Now it was time to talk face to face. He came to the small square in the center of the village. He looked at the metal ball that was fishing in midair. Every time he saw it there was a kind of amazing feeling. The contrast with the rough rock houses around it was very clear. Dean said to the general in front of the stairs, "I want to see the great priest. Trouble me to inform her." The general looked at Dean indifferently. He went up the stairs and whispered in front of the cabin door. There was a light sound from the cabin. The general understood and came in front of Dean. "Please." Dean nodded slightly. This time he didn't bring the demon hunting tool, so naturally he didn't need to disarm himself. He stepped on the stairs and came to the cabin door. The cabin door slowly opened. It was still luxurious and bright inside. Dean went in and saw Amelie, who was standing in front of the curtain. "Mr. Dean, how are you living here?" Amelie looked at Dean with a smile. Dean indifferently said, "The environment here is average, but the people are good." Mr. Dean really knows how to talk. "Of course, our place can't compare to the divine wall you live in." Amelie chuckled. Dean glanced at her and looked at the great priest. "Greetings, great priest." "Mr. Dew, you don't have to be so polite." The great priest smiled. Dean stared at the great priest's eyes. "Great priest, I came here today because I have something to ask of you. The Earth Dragon Cave will open soon. I'm quite curious about the Earth Dragon Cave. I want to go in and talk about it. I hope the great priest will allow me to do so." The smile in the great priest's eyes slowly faded. "Mr. Dean, what do you mean? There's no overtone." "That's what I mean." Dean looked at her. The great divine priest frowned and said, "Mr. Dew, are you here for the Earth Dragon Cave?" "Great priest, I know nothing about the Earth Dragon Cave. I heard from the villagers that the wild worm can enhance one's strength. Who doesn't want to get such a thing? Is there anything more attractive than power in this world?" Dean said calmly. The grand priest stared at him and said softly, "Could it be that your lover is not as attractive as your power?" Dean replied, "She is priceless and can't be measured by anything. Strength can be pursued. It's a vulgar thing." "What a vulgar thing!" The great priest sneered. "You finally couldn't stand it after more than 20 days. Dean quietly looked at her. "I just want to see if the wild worm is useful to me. If the great priest feels embarrassed, then forget it. I've been here for a long time. If you don't have a way to restore my lover, then I won't continue to waste time here. Goodbye." The great priest and Amelie were startled. They didn't expect Dean to leave so quickly. Amelie quickly said, "Wait." Dean was relieved to see her timely reply. He intended to stay for a while and wait for them to persuade him to stay. If they didn't, then it would be embarrassing. Fortunately, the situation was as he wished. "What?" Dean looked at her. Amelie turned to look at the great priest behind the curtain. The great priest frowned slightly. After a moment of silence, he said, "Mr. Dean, you have been here for so long. It is a bit unreasonable for you to leave just like that. What if your companions are attracted after you leave? Wouldn't that put us in danger?" Dean indifferently smiled. There was a hint of mockery in his tone. "Great priest, according to what you said, I can't stay or leave?" The great priest's eyes lit up. "It's not impossible if you want to enter the Earth Dragon Cave. But I have a condition." "Say it," Dean generously said. It seemed that he was waiting for her to speak. His attitude made the great priest uncomfortable. She said, "Mr. Dean is from the God's Wall. I have some interest in the God's Wall. I hope that Mr. Dean can tell me." Dean indifferently said, "Of course, no problem." The great priest frowned as she saw Dean agree so readily. She felt uneasy in her heart. But before she could speak, she heard Dean say, "Does the great priest want to migrate the people here to God's Wall?" His words were like a thunderclap that exploded in the great priest's ears. The grand priest and Amelie were shocked as they stared at Dean in a daze. Dean knew that his guess was correct as he saw Amelie's change in expression. His heart was full of confidence. "Mr. Dean, you are right." The great priest quickly calmed down and slowly said, "We have lived here for hundreds of years. Although the resources are poor, it is still safe. If we move to another place, the journey will be long and we will suffer heavy casualties. You don't have to worry, we have no interest in moving to the God Wall. We just want to know how many powerhouses like you exist in the outside world." Dean faintly smiled. If it was an average person, he would really believe these words, but he had already seen through the situation here. The resources here were more than barren. The severe radiation had sterilized a large number of men who went out to hunt. As the number of women decreased, the number of children would also decrease. Sooner or later they would die out. It must be known that the speed of human reproduction was not slow. After hundreds of years of reproduction, there were still less than 1,000 people left. Especially with the distorted view of marriage here, the population was still unable to increase. It could be seen how fast the speed of extinction was. In his opinion, the population here would shrink by more than half in less than 30 years. In another 50 years it was estimated that they would face extinction. It would be good if more than a dozen people survived. It was impossible for them to not predict such a situation. A safe living environment was more important than anything else. Although this place was safe, but the serious radiation infiltration was irresistible. In the 20 days I've lived here, ever since I learned from Prelay that the earthworm cave will open in a month, I've wanted to go take a look. That's why I've insisted on staying here. Dean seemed to be talking about insignificant things. He said lightly, "When I have free time, I think that I want to go to the Earth Dragon Cave to have a look. So, why did you let an outsider stay here? What's the purpose of it?" Now I probably know the answer. Chapter 837. Did you expect it? That's why you dared to come to us? The great priest coldly stared at Dean. She didn't want to continue to hide anything from Dean. Dean indifferently said, "I've been waiting for more than 20 days. I've guessed that you have an intention towards me, but I don't know what it is. I didn't know until you asked me about the God's Wall. I don't think it's a problem. The God's Wall is very vast and most of the territory is uninhabited. Moreover, the environment here is heaven. It can accommodate all of you." Great Priest's eyes lit up. "How do I know if what you said is true or false? If I didn't tell you in the beginning then, I would have guessed your thoughts. Would you be more willing to believe me?" Dean sneered. "I can pretend that I don't know anything and answer you foolishly. Then you will spend time to guess. What's the point of that? What you are looking for is to move to the God's Wall. It's a very, very, very small thing. It's like a bug flying into your village. No one will notice it. Of course the metaphor isn't appropriate, but it's the fact." Amelia was shocked as she looked at the great priest. According to Dean, the territory of the God's Wall was unimaginably vast. The Grand Priest's expression was indifferent. "It's not like I don't know anything about the Divine Wall. I know that the territory there is vast and the Divine Wall is extremely tough. It can withstand the invasion of the majority of wild beasts. Tens of millions of people can live there. However, what I want to know is what kind of world the Divine Wall is like. Is it a world where the weak are prey to the strong?" Dean chuckled. "It seems that any world is like that. Isn't it the same here?" "Presumptuous." Amelie's eyebrows rose. "We are not like that here. We are very peaceful. There has never been a war. There is no war because they are tamed. They don't have greed." Dean faintly looked at her. "If another girl appears in the village and replaces your position, then she will be the goddess and you can only be an ordinary villager. Will you be willing to eat the same bad food as them? If you are not satisfied, what will you do? There is no war here, but the weak are still the servants. You are the rulers." Amelia gritted her teeth. I won't." Dean shrugged his shoulders. Great Priest coldly stared at Dean. It had been a long time since someone spoke to her with such an attitude. She was angry, but she knew that Dean carried the hope of their continuation. She thought for a moment. "In some sense you are right. But the law of the jungle has different distinctions. Some are naked and some are hidden in the dark. Which one is it in the wall?" "The second one," Dean said without thinking. He knew what the Great Priest was worried about. If the first one was the law of the jungle, then there would be no benevolence and justice on the surface. It would be no different from the monster world outside the giant wall. It would be the most inhumane world. It meant that the strong could burn and loot unscrupulously. There would be no order and rules to speak of. The law of the jungle was a cruel rule that couldn't be erased. In a sense, there was a distinction between the human society and the animal world. Although this was often said to be hypocritical, but it was the biggest difference between humans and animals. In the animal world, one would become prey if one didn't have enough strength. In the human world, one would be swallowed if one didn't have enough wisdom. The great priest nodded. It made her feel a little relieved. She could see that Dean wasn't lying. Moreover, the possibility of the first one was low. She asked, "Can you tell us the location of the wall?" Dean said, "You won't be able to go even if I tell you. It's a long journey and I've gone through many hardships to come here. Monsters are rare in the area around the wall. Generally people like Prelay can hunt there at any time. The number and strength of monsters are much higher in the farther places. As for the furthest place, it's the area where you live. We call it the abyss. It's usually forbidden to enter." Amelia was surprised. "Is it because the wild beasts here are more powerful?" "Yes." Dean nodded. "No one will come here unless they are courting death. We usually hunt in the wasteland outside the abyss. The area inside the wall is vast, so we don't need to hunt for sustenance. We rely on growing crop. The reason why we hunt is to expand the area. We hope that one day we can eliminate all the monsters in the world. Then only we humans will be left, and we can go anywhere we want." Naturally, this point was replaced by his own expectations and wishes. The reason why the witches were hunting was because of the needs of the Monster Research Institute and also the needs of the Kingdom of God. Eliminate all the monsters? Amelia knew that the monsters Dean was talking about were the wild beasts. Her eyes lit up as she heard Dean's words. There are so many monsters. Can we really eliminate all of them? It would be great if the origami were still here. If that was the case, we might really be able to travel to any place in the world like what you said. Unfortunately, we humans can only hide here. These wild beasts are too strong and there are too many of them. They reproduce very quickly. There's no way we can kill them all." At the end of her sentence, her eyes dimmed and her face was filled with frustration. "Although the task is difficult, but we don't know if we don't do it. After all, we humans used to be the rulers of the world." Dean's eyes flashed with a trace of passion. Amelia was surprised. "We were the rulers of the world? How is it possible? Why is it not possible?" Dean looked at her as if it was a matter of course. The great priest stared at Dean and slowly said, "You are right. We humans were the strongest race in the world before the catastrophe. But since the death of the origami, the status of humans has ceased to exist. I hope that there are surviving origami in this world that will lead us to the strongest." Dean slightly raised his eyebrows as he thought that this had nothing to do with the origami. But from her words he could see that they didn't know much about the things before the catastrophe. Otherwise they wouldn't put the origami in such a high position. He did not continue to delve into this problem, and changed the topic. "After I go to the Earth Dragon Cave, regardless of whether the desolate worms there can increase my power, I will tell you the location of the Divine Wall. However, it is still okay for you to hide here and live. If you move, with so many people, the number of people who can reach the Divine Wall alive will not exceed 5, or even all of you will die." "No." The great priest frowned. "You have to tell us the location of the God's Wall first. You can't go even if I tell you," Dean helplessly emphasized. The great priest coldly said, "How do you know that we can't go? We will find a way to get to the God's Wall. Even if we can't think of a way, then the next generation will be able to find a way to move to the God's Wall." Dean saw that she was so stubborn. He thought that it wouldn't be a problem for them to go to the wall. There was more than enough space to accommodate them. Even if there was any conflict, it would be solved by Aristotle. He said, Okay, I'll draw the route to the wall for you. But I can only draw half of it for you. I'll draw the rest for you after I come out of the dragon cave. Amelia was angry. Are you worried that we will break our promise? Of course. Dean didn't think about it. Amelia was so angry that her eyes rolled out. She stamped her feet but didn't know what to say to Dean. The great priest calmly said, "That won't do. What if the route you draw is wrong? Won't we suffer in vain? It seems that we can't trust each other." Dean frowned as he felt the problem. Trust was a problem. Moreover, their ancestors had eaten the loss of outsiders. It was difficult to build trust. The great priest also saw the problem. He pondered for a moment and said, "I have an idea. You take Amelie back to the divine wall first. After you finish this, Amelie will write a letter for you to bring back. That way there won't be a problem." Dean frowned. It was a bit of a waste of time. After all, he had experienced many dangers and wasted a lot of time. It would take several months to go back and forth. However, it was the only way. What if he kills me? Amelia was nervous and worried when she heard that she had to leave with Dean. The great priest said, "So, let Mr. Dean leave your lover here. When you bring back Amelie's letter, I will." "No." Dean didn't wait for her to finish her words. He flatly refused. "I won't leave her here." The great priest didn't expect Dean's reaction to be so intense. He frowned. "She is just a corpse. We won't do anything to her. What are you worried about? Don't say any more. I won't leave her here as a mortgage." Dean's eyes flashed. His body exuded a murderous aura. The great priest knew that Dean was irritated. He didn't say anything else. Amelia wanted to jump up but didn't expect Dean's reaction to be stronger than her. She stared at Dean. "Can't my life be compared to hers? She is dead but I am alive." Chapter 838. You! Amelia was mad. She had never been wronged like this. She wanted to say more but was interrupted by the great priest. "Mr. Dean, do you have a better idea since this method doesn't work?" The great priest saw that Dean was serious. Although the words made her feel sullen, but it was not the time to fall out with Dean. She could only endure her anger. Dean coldly looked at Amelia. He didn't think that the little girl was cute anymore. "Since we can't trust each other, then the only way is for you to compromise." Amelia was angry. "Why should we compromise and not you?" "Because this exchange is unfair to begin with. To be honest, there is no room for discussion. You can either reject or agree." Dean's face was indifferent and his tone was stronger than before. There was a bit of aggressiveness in his tone. "I don't have to go to the dragon cave. For me, going there means that I have hope to improve my strength. I won't lose anything if I don't go. But you are different. If you don't move to the wall, then sooner or later you will be destroyed. How many years can you last here? 30 years? 50 years? This is a matter of life and death for all of you. But for me it's just a matter of improving my strength. What qualifications do you have to discuss with me about this exchange?" The great priest and Amelia were angry. But the great priest was a bit surprised. He didn't expect Dean's attitude to change so fast. Previously he was kind, but now he was as tough as a stone. "Mr. Dean, don't go too far." The great priest felt that he should save some face, so he said coldly, "This is still our territory. Do you think you can walk out of here without our permission? You are using your life in exchange. Isn't it worth it?" Dean sneered. "Let's not talk about whether you can keep me here or not. Even if you can keep me here, I guarantee that not many of you will survive. You can try if you don't believe me." The great priest didn't expect that Dean wouldn't budge an inch. Her face slightly changed. There was a trace of regret in her heart. She shouldn't have mentioned Dean's lover. She didn't want to see this situation. She said in a cold voice, "Mr. Dean, it won't be good for anyone if we fight each other. It will only make our human race die faster. I don't want to use the worst means to deal with you, but I hope that you won't bully people too much. I'm not bullying people. Dean saw her intention to compromise. He coldly snorted and said, You and I each take a step back. When I come out of the Earth Dragon Cave, I will draw the complete route for you. I can only guarantee that the route I give is absolutely reliable. In addition, I will also give you 2 pieces of news. The great priest's face turned ugly. It was tantamount to return to the original negotiation situation. But this time she couldn't refuse. Otherwise it would be equal to tearing off. I can tell you the first news now. Dean said in a cold voice, There is more than one God's Wall in this world. The God's Wall I told you about is called Sylvia's Wall. Not just one? The great priest's pupils constricted and his face was filled with shock. Amelie's eyes widened as she looked at Dean in surprise. What about the second news? Dean glanced at her. Aren't you too greedy to ask so much when you haven't paid anything? Amelia gritted her teeth in anger. But she knew that she had offended Dean, so it was natural for her to be targeted by him. But she was indignant in her heart. She had been defeated by a corpse. It was simply infuriating. The great divine priest slowly regained her composure. Her heart was still a bit shaken. She longed to be able to move to the God Wall and understand the general situation of the God Wall from the mouth of the outsiders from more than 100 years ago. However, she didn't expect that there was more than one paradise like this. Apart from feeling shocked, she also felt sad and angry. She felt sad because they were also humans, but they had lived in this desolate and barren land for hundreds of years. The great priest digested the news after a long silence. She looked at Dean. Okay, I agree to your conditions, but you have to swear that everything you said is true. Swear in the name of your lover. Dean clenched his fist. His eyes were full of killing intent. Do you like to self-destruct? The great priest's face slightly changed. It's just an oath. It won't hurt her unless what you said is a lie. This is a matter of dignity. Dean stared at her. Nothing can implicate her. If you want me to swear on my life, then I will completely agree. But you shouldn't involve her again and again. The great priest thought that it was because of his strong reaction to her that she believed that he wouldn't use her as an oath. But she knew that it was impossible as she looked at Dean's angry face. Well, swear in your own name. Too late. The killing intent in Dean's eyes gradually converged as he indifferently said, You can offend me and question me. But you shouldn't disrespect my lover. Now I've changed my mind. I won't give you the extra news. In addition, you have to apologize to my lover in person. What? Amelie's eyes widened. Apologize to her? How is that possible? We didn't do anything wrong. The great priest's face was full of anger as she felt that Dean had gone too far. Mr. Dean, do you have a guilty conscience? Dean coldly looked at them. Your ignorance will destroy your people. I gave you a chance, but you don't know how to cherish it. To be honest, I don't want to see this situation. But your ignorance has created such a situation. In that case, we have to bear the result together. She didn't want to see the relationship between the two sides break because she knew that she would have to pay a lot of price to threaten Dean. They had a good talk before, but all the factors changed when they talked about Dean's lover. She regretted it. She didn't think that Dean would put his lover in such an important position. It was even more important than herself. It was difficult for her to understand. But now she was the great priest. Naturally, she couldn't apologize to a dead body. Since you insist, then don't blame us for being impolite. The great priest gritted her teeth and signaled Amelie to get ready. Dean's eyes penetrated the curtains and saw her eyes. He sneered. You barbarians don't know how to be polite. Amelie, what does the great priest mean by reaching out to you? Amelie was about to attack Dean when she heard Dean's words. She was puzzled as she looked back. Did her sister have other instructions? Amelia felt her body lighten, and in the next moment, she was far away from the curtain. She felt a slender hand on her neck, strangling her throat. Her heart was cold as she knew that she had been fooled. You! The great priest was so angry that she stood up from the ground and lifted the curtains. It was reasonable to say that her identity couldn't be easily seen, but she had no time to care about it. She didn't know that Dean had seen her appearance through the curtains. You'd better stop. Dean indifferently looked at the great priest. Although I don't know what means you will use to subdue me. But no matter what you do, I guarantee that she will be buried with me before you make a move. The great priest knew that Dean was right. Not to mention her, even the strongest great priest wouldn't be able to save Amelia from Dean's hands. After all, she couldn't be faster than Dean's finger. Not to mention that Dean himself was a top master. If he used the mechanism, then Amelie would be shot. She gritted her teeth and said to Dean, "If anything happens to Amelie, then you won't be able to leave alive. Don't think that you can do whatever you want by holding her hostage. Although Amelie is a goddess, but there are many goddesses who have sacrificed their lives for the sake of their clansmen. Amelie is prepared for this." Amelie's pale face calmed down as she heard the great priest's words. Her body was no longer trembling. Her bright eyes were full of courage. It seemed that she was ready to die at any time. Dean felt that the hostages calmed down. He looked at the priest. "That's why I decided to give you another chance." The great priest frowned. Chapter 839. "No," great priest flatly said. "Amelie can't go to the dragon cave with you." Dean raised his eyebrows. "Why?" "It's too dangerous. I can protect her." Great priest said. "You can't even protect yourself in there. How can you protect her? If there's really danger, will you risk your life to protect her or yourself?" "She is a hostage. What's in it for me if she dies?" Dean didn't answer. "If she loses her life in the dragon cave, then you can besiege me and bury me with her. So I will protect her even if it's for my own life. Unless you want to compete with me now. But I guarantee that she will die in front of me." Great priest's face turned ugly. "I can promise you that I won't attack you after you come out of the dragon cave. But you can't take her there." Now that things have come to this, is there any meaning to such verbal promises? Dudian indifferently said, "I'm not familiar with the Earth Dragon Cave. It's good to have someone to guide me. In case you use some means that I don't know and wait for me to go in, then create danger in the cave. Wouldn't I be ambushed and killed by you in vain?" "We are not that shameless," Amelie angrily shouted. Dean pinched her chin with his fingers, deforming her face. Her mouth pouted and she couldn't speak. Great priest's face was gloomy. He knew that it would be difficult to change Dean's mind. The most important thing was that he didn't have a bargaining chip in his hand. Amelie would die if she refused Dean's proposal. But if she agreed, then it would be extremely dangerous for her to go to the dragon cave with her special body. The only advantage was that Dean would be buried with Amelie. She didn't need to go through her hands. There was some contradiction and hesitation in her eyes. "I'm willing to go." Amelie saw the entanglement and pain in the eyes of the great priest. She suddenly thought of the reason. She clenched her teeth and shook off Dean's hand. Amelie is a goddess. She should sacrifice herself for the tribe. Amelie is willing to take the risk. There was a trace of complex and guilt in the great priest's eyes. But it quickly disappeared. She didn't want Dean to see anything strange. She pretended to be in deep thoughts, but in fact she was adjusting her mood. After a moment she suppressed the sadness in her heart. She took a deep breath and looked at Dean. "All right, I promise you. But you have to release Amelie and give us the map of the wall." "Of course," Dean indifferently said. "I mean what I say. But you better not play any tricks." The great priest stared at him for a moment. "You better bring Amelie out safely. If anything happens to her, I will absolutely let you be buried with her." Dean was too lazy to listen to the nonsense. "You don't need to worry about this. There is still some time before the dragon cave opens. I want to know everything about the dragon cave so that the chances of me and your goddess coming out alive will be higher. You better tell me the truth. I will naturally tell you. The great priest coldly snorted. But I don't want the villagers to know about what happened here today. It's not a good thing for you. I hope you understand. Of course I won't publicize it, Dean said. It was not good for him. The great priest wanted to keep it a secret because he was worried that the villagers would riot and cause unnecessary war. After all, the villagers couldn't tolerate the fact that he had kidnapped the goddess and was still living in the village. If there is nothing else, then I will leave first. You can ask Wang to come and tell me about the dragon cave, Dean said. He didn't want to continue to stay here as he felt that his life would be threatened at any time. The great priest slightly frowned but didn't say anything. Her eyes turned to Amelie. Her lips slightly moved, but in the end she didn't speak. Dean suddenly said, "In fact, we could have carried out this transaction peacefully. You wanted to go to the wall and I just wanted to go to the dragon cave. There wouldn't be much loss to either of us. But now it has become like this. It's a pity." The great priest looked at him. She also had the same thoughts, but there was no way to reverse the situation. She said, "These things wouldn't have happened if you could trust us." Dean sneered. "Wouldn't it be the same if you could trust me?" But he didn't say it as it was meaningless to talk about it. He said, "Open the door." The great priest deeply looked at him. She raised her hand and knocked on the wall. The metal door slowly opened. Dean didn't continue to choke Amelie's neck. He put his palm on her shoulder. It seemed to be very gentle, but in fact he was using his strength to remind her not to play tricks. Amelia fiercely stared at Dean. Dean pulled her out of the room and they went down the stairs. The two generals who were guarding the stairs were surprised to see Dean and Amelie come out together. One of them came forward and shouted, "Please take your hand away! How can you touch the goddess?" Dean didn't speak but glanced at Amelie. Amelie gritted her teeth, but she knew that she had to cooperate with Dean. She immediately said, "It's nothing. I'm going to Mr. Dean's residence to teach him the teachings of God. You wait for me." The two generals looked at each other and bowed their heads respectfully. They retreated to the side. Dean glanced at Amelie. She was very vengeful. She wanted to teach me? He exerted a little force with his fingers, and Amelia cried out in pain. When the two wilderness generals looked up in shock, he quickly hid the painful expression on his face and pretended to be calm. "Nothing, I just saw a disgusting bug." When the two desolate generals heard this, they hurriedly looked around in search of the disgusting bug she mentioned. Dean raised his eyebrows and quickly left. Dean closed the door after returning to his residence. He threw Amelie into the room. "Be honest for the next few days or you will suffer." "You." Amelia clenched her teeth in anger. But she knew that Dean wasn't a person who would have tender feelings for the fairer sex. She stood in the corner of the room with her back facing Dean. Dean looked at her position. "Stand in the middle. Don't leave my body for 2 meters. Amelie turned her head and said angrily, "Why? You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.